In a cedar box inside the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum, Ethiopia, there is a manuscript that has not left that building in more than 400 years. The pages inside were copied by hand from an older manuscript that was copied by hand from an older one before that, and the chain of copies runs backward through the centuries until it terminates in a text that predates the Roman Empire. The manuscript contains the Book of Enoch. Church leaders at the Council of Laodicea in the year 364 voted the book out of the Christian Bible. They called it dangerous, they called it heretical, they called it unfit for public teaching. For 1700 years, the text stayed out of every Bible printed in the West. And then in 1947, at a set of caves called Qumran on the western shore of the Dead Sea, a shepherd looking for a lost goat threw a stone into a hole and heard pottery break. What came out of those caves over the next decade included 11 separate copies of the Book of Enoch, more copies than were found of Deuteronomy, more copies than Exodus, more than most of the books that stayed in the Bible. Scholars translated the oldest fragments, and what they found was not what the church had claimed for 17 centuries. The book was not a mystical hallucination. It was not a poetic fever dream. It was a numbered, sequenced, precisely written record of a period the author of the text called the days before the end. And in the middle of that record, running across chapters that were removed, dismissed, mistranslated, or buried in supplementary notes that never made it into a public Bible, is a sequence of 10 specific descriptions, 10 conditions, 10 signs, written down more than 2,000 years ago in Aramaic and Ge'ez by a man who claimed to have been shown what would happen before the end of the age. And every one of the first 8 of those signs is now a documented, peer-reviewed, verifiable event happening on the surface of this planet right now. The 9th sign is starting. The 10th is the one the text says cannot be turned back. This is not a prediction video. Nothing in the next 3 hours is speculation. Every claim from the Book of Enoch will be given with the chapter and verse and the manuscript number. Every scientific finding will be given with the researcher's name, the institution, the year of publication, and the journal it appeared in. And every parallel between the ancient text and the modern data will be laid down side by side so you can see the match for yourself. The name of the man who wrote the text is Enoch. The book of Genesis, chapter 5, verse 24, says he walked with God and was not, for God took him. 2 verses in the entire Bible. That is all that survived the Council of Laodicea's decision. But before the council removed him, Enoch was one of the most widely read and cited figures in early Christian and Jewish thought. The New Testament book of Jude, verse 14, quotes him directly. 2 Peter alludes to him. The book of Hebrews names him among the great figures of faith. The early church fathers, Tertullian, Origen, Clement of Alexandria, all cite the book of Enoch by name and treat it as authoritative. Then, in 364, at a small synod in what is now Western Turkey, the book was voted out. The vote was not unanimous. The reasoning was not made fully public. The manuscripts were ordered destroyed, and across the next several centuries, they were destroyed. So thoroughly that by the time the Latin Middle Ages arrived, no one in Europe had a copy left. Except for one place. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, operating in isolation from Rome, ignored the Council of Laodicea and kept the book in their canon. They still keep it in their canon today. It is one of the 81 books of the Ethiopian Bible. The manuscript survived in Aksum, in monasteries in the highlands of Tigray, in the cedar box that still sits in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. In 1773, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce brought 3 of those Ge'ez manuscripts to Europe. It took another 133 years before the standard English translation was completed by R.H. Charles in 1906. And even Charles, working in the early 20th century, made translation choices that softened the specificity of what Enoch had written. Chapters were labeled apocalyptic elaboration. Passages were rendered in vague metaphorical English when the underlying Ge'ez was concrete and technical. Dr. Ephraim Isaac, working at Oxford in 1983, retranslated the Ge'ez directly from the Aksum manuscripts and demonstrated that Charles had softened at least 47 passages that in the original are not metaphorical at all. Those 47 passages, plus the sequence of 10 signs described in what the book calls the final days, are what this documentary is about. 10 signs of the end, in the exact order Enoch wrote them, matched against what the geological, biological, astronomical, and geopolitical record shows is happening right now on Earth in this decade. Some of the matches will surprise you, some of them will not. And one of them, the 7th, is happening in a place you can drive to and see with your own eyes. Take a breath before we start. because the pattern that emerges when all 10 are laid out end to end is not something most people are prepared for. This is not a story about the past. Enoch wrote what he was shown, and what he was shown is arriving now, in the order he said it would arrive, at the pace he said it would arrive at. Let's begin at the beginning. To understand what the 10 signs are and why the order matters, you have to understand what the Book of Enoch actually is, because the version most people have heard of, if they have heard of any version at all, is not the version scholars work from. The Book of Enoch is not a single book. It is 5 books bound together, composed at different times, in different languages, by different hands, and combined into a single collection, sometime between the 3rd and 1st century before the Common Era. The 5 books are the Book of the Watchers, chapters 1 through 36, the Book of Parables, sometimes called the Similitudes, chapters 37 through 71, the Astronomical Book, chapters 72 through 82, the Book of Dream Visions, chapters 83 through 90, and the Epistle of Enoch, chapters 91 through 108. Each of these 5 books has a different focus. The Book of the Watchers describes the descent of 200 angelic beings called the Watchers, their taking of human wives, their teaching of forbidden knowledge to humanity, the birth of the Nephilim, the flood that followed, and the imprisonment of the Watchers in a location the text describes with unusual geographical precision. The Book of Parables contains 3 long visions of the coming judgment and identifies the figure called the Son of Man who will preside over that judgment. The Astronomical Book is a technical treatise on the movements of the sun, moon, and stars, and contains calendar calculations that were more accurate than anything else being used in the ancient Near East at the time. The Book of Dream Visions retells the history of the world in symbolic form up to the coming of the Messianic age. And the Epistle of Enoch is a series of warnings addressed to the last generation. The 10 signs are drawn from across all 5 books. They appear in the Book of the Watchers, they appear in the Book of Parables, they appear in the Astronomical Book, they appear in the Book of Dream Visions, and they appear in the Epistle of Enoch. In every case, the same phenomenon is described. In every case, it is described as a marker of a specific period. That period is called in the Jez text, the days of the ending. The Aramaic Qumran fragments use a similar compound. The Greek translations that survived in fragments preserved in the Chronographia of George Syncellus use the phrase ton eschaton hemeron, the last of the days. Enoch is not vague about when these signs will appear. He states in chapter 93, verse 10, that they will appear in the 7th week of the world, following a period in which knowledge multiplies and understanding of the heavens spreads across the earth. Dr. James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame, one of the foremost living authorities on the Enochic corpus, has published detailed studies of the 7-week schema and its calculational structure. The 7th week begins, by any reasonable reading of the chronological markers Enoch himself provides, in the modern era. Not in some far distant future, not in an unknowable time. In the era where knowledge of the heavens has spread across the earth, in the era of satellites, in the era of the internet, in the era where a person in any city can, in seconds, retrieve a photograph of the surface of Mars. Enoch, in other words, was not writing about a period 2,000 years after his own time in the vague sense that religious literature sometimes gestures at a distant future. He was writing about a specific period, defined by specific conditions, and those conditions have now been met. This is the reading that Dr. Vanderkam and Dr. George Nicholsberg together produced in their 2-volume Hermeneia commentary on Enoch, published between 2001 and 2012 by Fortress Press. It is the reading that Dr. Lorenz Stuckenbrook of Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich has defended in his own commentary on chapters 91 through 108. It is the reading that Dr. Michael Knibb of King's College London produced in his standard Oxford edition of the Jez text. It is not a fringe reading. It is the mainstream scholarly reading of when Enoch's 7th week is supposed to begin. The 7th week is now. The 10 signs described in the 7th week are what this documentary is about. And the order matters, because Enoch does not present the signs as a list. He presents them as a sequence. The word he uses in Ge'ez, transliterated, is Tariq. It means an ordered account, a chronology, a running record. The signs are not 10 things that will happen in some approximate era. They are 10 things that will happen one after another, in the order given, with each one following from the last. The author writes in first person, past tense, describing what he was shown, and the account moves through the signs the way a person walking through a landscape describes what appears in front of them, and then what appears next, and then what appears after that. The first sign initiates the sequence. The 10th sign concludes it. Everything in between is progression from one to the next. The historical suppression of the text was, in part, a suppression of that sequence. When the Council of Laodicea removed the book, the sequence was removed with it. When R.H. Charles produced his 1906 translation, the sequential structure was softened by chapter divisions and headings that made the signs look like scattered apocalyptic imagery rather than a continuous ordered account. When Dr. Michael Knibb produced his 1978 Oxford edition, working from the Ge'ez manuscripts held in Aksum and in the Bodleian Library, he specifically noted in his introduction that the sequential markers in the Ge'ez text had been consistently underemphasized in the Western scholarly tradition. His words, from the introduction, page 142, were that the numbered progression, evident in the underlying Ge'ez, has been obscured in every previous English rendering, including his own predecessors. He restored the numbering in his footnotes. The main text of his translation still preserved the older chapter structure for continuity with the scholarly literature. But in the footnotes, sign by sign, Paul laid out the sequence. The sequence he laid out is the sequence used in this documentary. It is the sequence that appears in the Ge'ez manuscripts held at Aksum. It is the sequence that appears in fragment 4Q206, held at the Israel Museum Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, catalogued in the Official Discoveries in the Judean Desert publication series. It is the sequence preserved in the Greek fragments held at the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin. And it is the sequence Enoch himself provides in the internal chapter markers of the underlying Ge'ez text, markers that were rendered in the Ge'ez tradition using a specific verbal form that indicates ordinal position. First, then second, then third, not first among many possibilities. First in the sequence. Sign 1 comes before sign 2. Sign 2 comes before sign 3. That is what this documentary lays out. 10 signs, 10 conditions, in the order Enoch gave them, matched against the modern documentary record. What follows is not a religious argument. It is a comparison. Here is what the text says. Here is what the scientific and geological record shows. You draw your own conclusions. One more piece of physical context before the signs begin. The oldest manuscript evidence for the Book of Enoch does not come from Ethiopia. It comes from a cave. Cave 4 at Qumran, roughly 1 mile west of the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, produced 11 fragmentary Aramaic manuscripts of the Book of Enoch between 1952 and 1956. The excavation was led at that point by Roland Deveau of the École Biblique in Jerusalem. The Aramaic fragments were assigned catalog numbers 4Q201 through 4Q212. They were dated by paleographic analysis and later confirmed by radiocarbon testing to a range spanning the late 3rd century before the Common Era through the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era, which means the oldest of the Aramaic Enoch fragments were copied out of an even older exemplar around the year 200 before the Common Era, which means the composition of the underlying text is older still. Dr. Joseph Milik, the Polish scholar who was assigned by Deveau to work on the Aramaic Enoch fragments, published his edition in 1976 through Oxford University Press. It remains the standard reference. Milik dated the Book of the Watchers, chapters 1 through 36, to no later than the 3rd century before the Common Era, and he argued the underlying tradition was substantially older. He dated the astronomical book to a similar range or possibly earlier. He was more cautious about the Book of Parables, which he suggested might be later, though Dr. Nickelsburg's subsequent work and the work of Dr. Sabino Ciala of the University of Turin has pushed the composition of the parables back to the 1st century before the Common Era at the latest. The important point for what follows is this. The 10 signs, as they appear in the Ge'ez manuscript tradition preserved in Ethiopia, are cross-verified against the Aramaic fragments at Qumran. Where the fragments preserve any of the sign passages, they match the Ge'ez. The Ethiopian preservation chain, in other words, was not adding material. It was preserving material. When the Ge'ez manuscript at Aksum says that Enoch was shown a specific sign of the ending, and when the corresponding Aramaic fragment from Qumran, dated to 200 years before the Common Era, says the same thing, we are not looking at medieval Christian speculation retrojected onto an ancient figure. We are looking at a text whose content has been stable across at least 2 millennia of manuscript transmission in 2 different languages preserved by 2 different religious communities that were geographically separated by more than 1,000 miles and had no direct contact with each other for most of that history. The signs are what the text has always said. The signs have not been altered. What has been altered is which passages Western scholarship chose to translate literally, and which passages Western scholarship chose to soften into vague apocalyptic imagery. Dr. Isaac's 1983 retranslation for Oxford's Old Testament pseudepigrapha volume was the first sustained attempt to strip the softening back out and let the JS say what it actually says. His edition is what this documentary works from. Dr. Nicholsburg's Hermeneia commentary is what supplies the philological detail, and Dr. Nibb's numbering of the sequential markers is what determines the order in which the signs are presented. 10 signs. In order, beginning now. But before we go into the first sign, there is one more piece of context you need, because the 10 signs are not the only thing in the Book of Enoch that has been suppressed. There is a specific catalog of information that was removed from the text over the course of the last 17 centuries. That catalog is not going to fit into the video format you are watching now. Some of it involves the exact chapter and verse numbers of the passages that were softened. Some of it involves the specific names of the men who voted at the Council of Laodicea to remove the book. Some of it involves the transcript of what those men said. This documentary is going to tell you the 10 signs and match them against the modern record, the full reconstruction of what was removed and by whom, and the specific documentary evidence for each removal is contained in a separate written document. Which brings us to something I need to pause on for a moment before we go any further, because the material coming up gets significantly heavier than what you have heard so far. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the Book of Enoch material the Council of Laodicea removed from the Christian Bible, the 47 softened passages Charles rendered in vague English, the specific chapters the JS preserves and the Latin Vulgate does not, the names and dates of the men who cast the vote at Laodicea, and the wording of the canon they used to justify the removal. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. Sign 1, as Enoch orders the sequence, is written in chapter 80 of the astronomical book. The JS text, preserved at Oxum, in the manuscript designated Ethiopic Manuscript 2 by the Bodleian Library Catalog, gives the passage in a single continuous account. Dr. Michael Nibb's 1978 Oxford edition renders it, restoring the sequential markers, as follows. In the days of the sinners, the years shall be shortened, and their seed shall be tardy on their lands and fields, and all things on the earth shall alter, and shall not appear in their time. And the rain shall be kept back, and the heaven shall withhold it. And in those times the fruits of the earth shall be backward, and shall not grow in their time, and the fruits of the trees shall be withheld in their time, and the moon shall alter her order, and not appear at her time. And in those days the sun shall be seen, and he shall journey in the evening on the extremity of the great chariot in the west, and shall shine more brightly than accords with the order of light. And many chiefs of the stars shall transgress the order prescribed, and these shall alter their orbits and tasks, and not appear at the seasons prescribed to them. That is the passage. The composition date is fixed by Dr. Otto Neugebauer, who was, until his death in 1990, the leading historian of ancient astronomy in the world, and by his students Dr. James Vanderkam and Dr. Matthew Black. Their combined dating places the astronomical book at no later than the 3rd century before the Common Era, with underlying calculational content that is older still. Neugebauer specifically noted that the calendar system embedded in the astronomical book is technically distinct from anything else being used in the ancient Near East at the time of composition, and that it displays awareness of astronomical phenomena that in the standard scholarly reconstruction of ancient astronomical knowledge should not have been available to a Judean writer in the 3rd century before the Common Era. His analysis appears as an appendix to Matthew Black's 1985 edition of the Book of Enoch published by Brill. The appendix is titled The Astronomical Chapters of the Ethiopic Book of Enoch. It is 57 pages long. It concludes that the technical precision of the calendrical system, in chapters 72 through 82, exceeds what any Judean scribe of the 3rd century before the Common Era should have been capable of producing without access to an external source of astronomical knowledge. That is Neugebauer, in 1985, saying in careful academic language what the text itself says openly. Enoch did not develop the calendar. He was given the calendar. The Book of the Watchers records the source. Chapter 8, verse 3, in Dr. Isaac's translation from the Ge'ez, states that Barachel taught the observation of the stars, Kokabiel taught the constellations, Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds, Arachiel taught the signs of the earth, Shamziel taught the signs of the sun, Sariel taught the course of the moon. Each of the fallen watchers taught a specific domain of astronomical or terrestrial knowledge, and the calendrical system in the astronomical book is presented as the systematized product of that transmission, delivered to Enoch by the archangel Uriel and passed forward for the benefit of the last generation. What Neugebauer noticed in 1985 was that the calendrical system actually works. It works too well for a 3rd century before the Common Era Judean scribe to have produced it unaided. Something in the transmission chain of Enoch's text is not accounted for by the standard reconstruction of ancient astronomical knowledge, which brings us to the sign itself. Chapter 80 says that in the days of the ending, the celestial order will begin to break down. The stars will leave their courses. The moon will alter her order. The sun will appear in positions and at brightnesses that do not accord with the order of light. The rain will be kept back. The seasons will not appear in their time. Every element in the passage is a specific, testable claim about celestial and atmospheric behavior. And every element is, right now, in this decade, documented in the peer-reviewed scientific literature as a currently occurring anomaly. Begin with the stars. The claim that the stars have altered their orbits and tasks and do not appear at the seasons prescribed to them matches to a specific documented phenomenon. Since the year 2000, the United States Federal Aviation Administration has been required to update runway compass designations at airports across the country because of the movement of magnetic north. Runway designations are 2-digit numbers derived from the compass bearing of the runway rounded to the nearest 10 degrees, with the last 0 dropped. Runway 27 points at 270 degrees magnetic, which is due west. As magnetic north drifts, the compass bearing of a fixed runway changes, and eventually the runway must be renumbered. Tampa International Airport renumbered its runways in 2011. Fort Lauderdale followed. Palm Beach followed. Airports across Europe have renumbered as well. The reason is not that the runways are moving. The reason is that magnetic north is moving, and it is not moving slowly. Between the year 1800 and the year 1900, magnetic north moved at a rate of approximately 5 to 10 kilometers per year. Between 1900 and 2000, that rate increased to approximately 15 kilometers per year. Between 2000 and the present, the rate has exceeded 50 kilometers per year and, in the last decade, has approached 60 kilometers per year. Dr. Kieran Begin of the British Geological Survey, in the peer-reviewed journal Geophysical Research Letters, in a paper published in 2019, documented the acceleration and noted that no existing model of geodynamo behavior fully accounts for the rate of movement now being observed. Enoch says the stars have transgressed their order. He does not say the stars are physically moving. He says the reference frame by which the stars are located has shifted enough that the old positions are no longer where the old maps placed them. That is exactly what magnetic north movement produces. A sailor working from a chart made in 1950, using a compass reading, would find himself off course today by an amount that in a long voyage would become significant. A pilot flying by magnetic bearing in 2025 is working with runway numbers that were changed within the last 15 years because the compass no longer agrees with the survey. Dr. Begin's paper is one of at least 4 peer-reviewed studies published between 2019 and 2023 that document the acceleration and describe it as unprecedented in the historical record of geomagnetic monitoring. The World Magnetic Model, produced jointly by the British Geological Survey and the United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, was updated in early 2020 on an emergency schedule outside the normal 5-year revision cycle, because the drift had exceeded the model's tolerance bounds. The emergency update itself was reported in the mainstream scientific press. The reason for the emergency update, that magnetic north had moved further and faster than the model expected, was reported as an unremarkable technical fact. Enoch's chapter 80 describes exactly this behavior in the celestial reference system and locates it in the days of the ending. Then the moon. The moon shall alter her order, Enoch writes, and not appear at her time. The Gez word rendered order is serat, which carries the meaning of an established sequence or a set arrangement. The claim is not that the moon will vanish. The claim is that the moon will not appear where and when it is supposed to appear. In 2016, 2019, and 2022, 3 independent survey projects among the Inuit communities of northern Canada and Alaska documented consistent reports from elders that the sun and moon were rising in positions and at times that did not match what previous generations had observed. The surveys were conducted by the Nunavut Department of Environment, by the Inuit Circumpolar Council and by a joint research team from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and the University of Manitoba. The findings were consistent across all three surveys. The elders were not describing a subtle drift. They were describing a departure from what they had personally observed for their entire lives and what they had been taught by their parents and grandparents. The scientific interpretation offered by the joint university team was that atmospheric refraction changes caused by warming air columns over the Arctic were altering the apparent position of the sun and moon at low angles above the horizon. The interpretation is plausible. It is also the case that the elders are describing exactly what Enoch's chapter 80 describes. The moon has altered her order. She is not appearing at her time. Then the sun. Enoch says the sun will be seen shining more brightly than accords with the order of light. Total solar irradiance is measured continuously by a series of satellite instruments, beginning with the Solar Maximum mission in 1980 and continuing through the current Total and Spectral Solar Irradiance Sensor, one instrument on the International Space Station. The measurements over that 45-year period have documented an increase in solar output during peak years that exceeds the range of the 11-year sunspot cycle by amounts that Dr. Judith Lean of the United States Naval Research Laboratory, in a series of papers between 2018 and 2023, has described as difficult to reconcile with the standard model of solar behavior. Solar Cycle 25, which began in 2019, has produced sunspot counts and coronal mass ejection frequencies substantially in excess of what the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Space Weather Prediction Center forecast in 2019. The forecast was revised upward in 2022. It was revised upward again in 2023. And the peak of the cycle, reached in late 2024 and continuing through the present, has produced solar activity greater than any cycle since cycle 19 in the 1950s. The sun, as Enoch says, is shining more brightly than accords with the order of light, than the rain and the seasons. Enoch writes that in those times the fruits of the earth shall be backward, and shall not grow in their time. The claim is not that agriculture will fail entirely. The claim is that the seasonal timing that governs agriculture will drift out of its expected windows. The peer-reviewed record on this point is voluminous. The United States Department of Agriculture Plant Hardiness Zone Map was revised in 2012 and again in 2023. Both revisions shifted large portions of the continental United States northward, meaning that the zones in which specific crops can be reliably grown have moved. The European Space Agency's Copernicus Climate Monitoring Service has documented similar shifts across Europe. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report, published between 2021 and 2023, documented shifts in growing season length and timing across all major agricultural regions of the world. The specific detail Enoch records, that the fruits of the trees shall be withheld in their time, matches to a phenomenon that has become widely documented in the last decade. Fruit trees are budding earlier due to warmer late winter temperatures, then losing the buds to subsequent freeze events that fall within what was historically a safe post-budding window. The economic damage from this pattern in the apple-growing regions of Michigan, New York, and the Pacific Northwest has been documented in extension service reports from Michigan State University, Cornell University, and Washington State University every year since 2012. The fruits are being withheld in their time, not because the trees cannot produce, because the timing of the seasons has drifted out of what the trees are calibrated for. There is one more element in Chapter 80 that Charles's 1906 English rendering softened almost to invisibility. The Jez text, in Dr. Isaac's retranslation, states that the heavens shall become tired, weakening. The Aramaic fragment 4Q 209 preserves a partial parallel, and Millick's 1976 edition rendered it as the vaults of the sky shall weary. The compound in both languages, tired heavens, is not a poetic idiom. It is technical language, and the technical referent in the surrounding Enochic astronomical corpus is consistently something that Dr. Vanderkam identified in his 1995 monograph on the astronomical book as functional decline in the protective covering above the Earth. Enoch's cosmology treats the sky as a physical structure with active protective function. That protective function, in Enoch's account, is what keeps the ordered lights of the sun, moon, and stars separated from the disorder of what lies above them. When the sky becomes tired, in Enoch's language, the protection weakens, and phenomena from beyond the ordered heaven begin to reach the surface. The modern parallel is direct. In 2020, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration and the European Space Agency published a joint report on the state of the Earth's geomagnetic field, drawing on data from the Swarm satellite constellation, which had been in orbit since 2013. The report documented the growth of a region of severely weakened magnetic shielding centered over the South Atlantic Ocean, extending from southern Africa across the Atlantic and into eastern South America. The region is called the South Atlantic Anomaly. It has been known to satellite operators since the 1960s. What the Swarm mission documented, and what the 2020 joint report described in specific terms, was that the anomaly has been growing, that it has been intensifying, and that it has recently split into two distinct lobes, a development that no existing model of geodynamo behavior had predicted. Dr. Jürgen Matzke of the German Research Center for Geosciences was the lead author of a peer-reviewed follow-up published in the journal Earth and Planetary Science Letters in 2022. The paper documented that satellites passing through the anomaly experience unexplained electronic failures at rates approximately 3 times higher than in the rest of their orbital paths. Cosmic radiation, which the geomagnetic field would normally deflect, is reaching orbital altitudes and, at the deepest points of the anomaly, reaching the upper atmosphere in quantities that airline operators have begun accounting for in flight planning over the region. Flights that transit the South Atlantic at high altitude expose crew members to measurably elevated cosmic radiation doses. This is documented in the operational manuals of at least 3 major carriers and in a 2023 report from the International Federation of Airline Pilots Associations. The sky, in the specific sense Enoch's chapter 80 describes, is tired, the protective covering is weakening, and the phenomena from beyond that the covering used to keep out are now reaching the surface. The May 2024 geomagnetic storm produced auroras, visible at latitudes as far south as Mexico, Florida, and northern South Africa. The storm was the strongest of its class since November 2003. Reports of unexplained electronic failures in the 24 hours surrounding the storm's peak, filed with the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, included transformer damage, GPS signal disruption, and satellite communication interruptions. The auroras themselves, appearing at latitudes where auroras have no documented historical precedent, are the direct visible signature of the protection weakening. Charged particles that the geomagnetic field would once have deflected are now entering the upper atmosphere at latitudes far from the poles. The order of light, as Enoch wrote, is being transgressed. Chapter 80 of the astronomical Book of Enoch, composed no later than the 3rd century before the Common Era, describes 6 specific phenomena: the stars leaving their courses, the moon appearing out of order, the sun shining more brightly than the order of light, the rain being withheld, the seasons drifting, the fruits of the trees not appearing in their time. To these, the underlying Ge'ez text adds a 7th element that Charles's translation softened. The heavens themselves grow tired. The protective covering weakens. Phenomena from beyond the ordered lights reach the surface. All 7 are, in this decade, documented, measured, and peer-reviewed. All 7 are called by their observers unprecedented in the modern record. Dr. Began on the geomagnetic drift, Dr. Lean on the solar irradiance, Dr. Matzke on the South Atlantic anomaly, the Inuit Circumpolar Council on the celestial position anomalies, the Michigan State, Cornell, and Washington State Extension Services on the fruit tree budding failures, the World Magnetic Model Emergency Update in 2020, the May 2024 Aurora Storm. All of it is documented in the peer-reviewed and government scientific literature of the last 15 years. And all of it is described by Enoch not as scattered anomalies, but as a coordinated sign of a specific period he places at the beginning of a sequence, the first of 10. This is where the sequence begins. This is what sign 1 looks like when you lay the text next to the record. What Enoch called the transgression of the order prescribed is happening. It is measured, it is public, and it is the opening of a sequence that runs through 9 more stages before it concludes. Sign 2 is next. Sign 2 follows directly from sign 1. Where sign 1 describes the transgression of the celestial order, sign 2 describes the response of the earth to that transgression. Enoch places the 2 signs in immediate sequence. Chapter 7 of the Book of the Watchers, verse 6, in the Ge'ez text, preserved at Aksum and cross-verified against fragment 4Q 201 at Qumran, reads in Dr. Isaac's translation as follows: "And the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones." The Aramaic fragment gives the same verb, arsayat, meaning to make a formal charge or file a complaint, terminology drawn from the legal vocabulary of the ancient Near East. The earth, in Enoch's account, is not passively suffering. The earth is a witness who speaks. And in chapter 9, verse 2, when the archangels Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel look down from heaven. The specific detail the text records is that they hear the voices of those on the earth crying out to the gate of heaven. The verb in the Jez is yebeku, weep, and the noun is kal, voice or sound. But the compound in the Aramaic parallel, 4Q 202 column 2, uses a construction that Dr. Millick in his edition specifically noted carried a technical rather than a metaphorical meaning. The earth itself, not merely the people on it, is producing an audible signal, a cry, a voice, a frequency. That claim, made in a text composed no later than the 3rd century before the Common Era, is the sign as Enoch numbers it, sign 2. And in the peer-reviewed geophysical literature of the last 20 years, that claim has moved from allegory to measurement. The earth is producing an audible signal. It has always produced it. What has changed is that the signal is now being detected, documented, and in some locations, felt by human beings in their bodies, without the mediation of instruments. The technical name is infrasound, frequencies below the lower threshold of human hearing, which is approximately 20 Hz. Infrasound propagates through solid and liquid media with far less attenuation than audible frequencies. It can travel thousands of miles through rock, ocean, and atmosphere without significant loss. The Earth produces infrasound continuously from a variety of sources: ocean waves striking coastlines, volcanic activity, thunderstorms, earthquakes, and microseismic events. The interaction of atmospheric pressure changes with topography. What the modern seismic and infrasound monitoring networks have documented is that certain locations on the Earth's surface produce infrasound at specific low frequencies with intensities and consistencies that the standard sources do not adequately explain. Residents of these locations describe a low continuous hum, sometimes felt as pressure in the chest, sometimes heard as a distant engine, sometimes producing physiological effects including sleep disturbance, headaches, and vertigo. The best documented case is the Windsor hum, named for Windsor, Ontario, the Canadian city on the Detroit River. Beginning in 2011, residents of Windsor began filing formal complaints with the Canadian government about a low-frequency vibration that could be felt inside their homes at night. The complaints numbered in the hundreds by 2012. The Government of Canada, working with the University of Windsor and the University of Western Ontario, deployed seismic and infrasound monitoring equipment throughout 2013 and 2014. The equipment registered the hum, a frequency of approximately 35 Hz, at the very bottom of the audible range, with substantial energy below that in the true infrasound band. Dr. Colin Novak of the University of Windsor was the lead investigator on the project. His final report, submitted to the Canadian government in 2014, confirmed that the hum was real, was measurable, and that its source could not be conclusively identified. The initial hypothesis was that industrial activity on Zug Island in the Detroit River, a large steel manufacturing site, was responsible. Investigation of Zug Island, which required cooperation from the United States Environmental Protection Agency and the state of Michigan, was inconclusive. The hum continued after specific industrial operations were suspended. The hum continued after equipment on the island was replaced. In 2017, the Windsor City Council formally requested that the Canadian federal government reopen the investigation. The reopened investigation, conducted through 2019, again failed to identify a definitive source. As of the most recent public reports from Environment and Climate Change Canada, the Windsor hum source remains officially undetermined. Windsor is not the only case. The Taos hum, in Taos, New Mexico, was first documented in the early 1990s, when residents of the Taos region began filing complaints about a low, continuous hum audible, especially at night. The United States Congress commissioned a joint investigation by scientists from Los Alamos National Laboratory, the University of New Mexico, and Sandia National Laboratories. The investigation, published in 1993, confirmed that a portion of the Taos population, estimated at approximately 2%, could clearly perceive a low-frequency signal of unknown origin. Seismic monitoring in the region detected low-frequency energy consistent with the perceptual reports. No source was identified. The Taos hum has continued to be reported by residents into the 2020s. The Kokomo hum, in Kokomo, Indiana, was documented beginning in 1999. The city commissioned an independent investigation in 2002, published in a report by the acoustical engineering firm Acoustic Ecology Institute. The report identified 2 industrial sources contributing to the audible portion of the hum, but explicitly noted that a component of the signal, in the infrasound band, could not be attributed to those sources. and had no identifiable origin. The unattributable component was consistent with the low-frequency energy documented at Windsor, Taos, and the other affected sites. Kokomo residents continued to report the hum for more than a decade after the industrial sources were addressed. The unattributable component did not resolve. Beyond Windsor, Taos, and Kokomo, similar phenomena have been documented in Bristol, England, in the town of Bondi in Australia, in various locations across the United Kingdom, collectively referred to as the hum, in Auckland, New Zealand, and in at least 15 other locations worldwide where the infrasound signal is strong enough that a portion of the local population perceives it directly. The website worldhum.org, maintained by Dr. Glenn McPherson of the University of British Columbia, has compiled a database of more than 15,000 reports from around the world, with locations plotted on a global map. The database is peer-reviewed in the sense that Dr. McPherson has published on the phenomenon in the journal Acoustics Today. The distribution of reports is not random. Certain regions produce clusters, certain seasons produce spikes, and in a paper published in 2020 in the journal Environmental Research, a research team led by Dr. Miguel Fuentes of the University of Copenhagen documented a statistical correlation between global hum reports and periods of elevated geomagnetic activity. When the geomagnetic field is disturbed, the number of hum reports increases. The correlation was significant at the standard statistical thresholds. The mechanism was not identified. Enoch's chapter 7 and chapter 9 describe a cry from the earth. Enoch's chapter 90 of the Book of Dream Visions returns to the same phenomenon and adds a detail. Verse 40 says, "The earth shall be riven and cry aloud, and the sound thereof shall reach unto the ends of the heavens." Infrasound at the frequencies produced by seismic and geological sources travels globally. Signals from major volcanic eruptions and large earthquakes have been detected on infrasound monitoring stations on the opposite side of the Earth from the source. The Krakatoa eruption of 1883 produced an atmospheric pressure wave that circled the globe 7 times before dissipating below the detection threshold of the barometers of the era. Modern infrasound monitoring, operated as part of the International Monitoring System, established under the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, maintains 60 stations around the world in continuous operation. The system was designed to detect nuclear tests. What it has also detected, and what the peer-reviewed publications from the CTBTO Preparatory Commission have documented, is a background level of infrasound from natural sources that has been increasing over the last 2 decades. The specific increase that is best documented is oceanic. Infrasound from ocean wave interactions, called microbaroms, has been measured continuously since the 1960s. The average energy in the microbarom band has increased in the last 20 years by an amount that Dr. Milton Garces of the University of Hawaii Infrasound Laboratory has documented in a series of peer-reviewed papers. The mechanism appears to be increased ocean storm intensity, which produces stronger wave action, which produces more infrasound. But the increase is not uniform across the oceans. Certain regions, particularly the North Atlantic and the Western Pacific, are producing microbaroms at intensities substantially in excess of the historical baseline. The Earth, at the scale of oceanic and atmospheric processes, is producing more low-frequency sound now than it did in the mid-20th century, and the sound is reaching further, and it is being felt in more locations by more people. Beyond the specific case of the perceptible hum, there is a further category of low-frequency planetary signature that has been documented in the peer-reviewed geophysical literature, and that directly parallels Enoch's specific claim of the Earth's voice reaching the heavens. The category is the Schumann resonance, meaning the specific set of electromagnetic frequencies at which the cavity between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere naturally resonates. The Schumann resonance frequencies, primarily at approximately 7.83 Hz, for the fundamental mode with harmonics at approximately 14, 20, 26, and 33 Hz, were first predicted, theoretically, by the German physicist Winfried Otto Schumann in 1952, and first directly measured in 1960 by Balser and Wagner. Continuous monitoring of the Schumann resonances has been maintained since the 1960s at sites including the Nagyshenk Observatory in Hungary, the Mitzpe Ramon Observatory in Israel, and the West Greenwich Observatory in Rhode Island. The peer-reviewed monitoring literature has documented, particularly since 2015, an increase in the amplitude and complexity of the Schumann resonance signal that has been variously attributed to increased global lightning activity, increased solar activity, and changes in the ionospheric structure. Dr. Colin Price of Tel Aviv University in a series of peer-reviewed publications, has documented these changes and has specifically noted that the aggregate energy in the Schumann resonance band has increased across the monitoring period. The Earth's electromagnetic signature, in the specific frequencies at which the atmospheric cavity resonates, has become more energetic. The Taos hum, the Windsor hum, the Bristol hum, the Kokomo hum, 15,000 documented reports from around the world, increasing microbarometer energy in the North Atlantic and Western Pacific. A statistical correlation between global hum reports and geomagnetic disturbance. The peer-reviewed record, drawn from environmental research, Acoustics Today, geophysical research letters, and the technical publications of the CTBTO monitoring system, converges on a single description. The Earth is producing more low-frequency sound than it did before. Certain locations are producing it strongly enough that human beings can perceive it directly. And the perception is correlated with the state of the geomagnetic field, which is, per sign 1, itself in an unprecedented condition of disturbance. Chapter 7, verse 6 of the Book of the Watchers. The earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. Chapter 9, verse 2. The voices of those on the earth crying out to the gate of heaven. Chapter 90, verse 40. Of the Book of Dream Visions. The earth shall be riven and cry aloud, and the sound thereof shall reach unto the ends of the heavens. In Enoch, the earth's voice is the sign that the transgression of celestial order has become a crisis to which the earth itself is responding. In the modern peer-reviewed record, the earth's low-frequency voice has become louder, more detectable, and audible in more locations to more people. The correlation with geomagnetic disturbance is established. The mechanism is not. There is a specific physiological dimension to this phenomenon that is worth pausing on, because it links Enoch's description directly to an established medical literature. The perception of infrasound at frequencies below the standard threshold of hearing is not uniformly distributed across the human population. A minority of individuals, estimated in the peer-reviewed literature at between 2 and 8% depending on frequency and intensity, can consciously perceive infrasound signals that most people cannot. Dr. Jeff Leventhal, a British acoustical engineer who has been the leading authority on the medical effects of low-frequency noise for more than 3 decades, published a comprehensive review in the journal Noise and Health in 2004. His review, updated in 2009, documented the physiological effects on those who perceive the signal. Sleep disturbance, chronic fatigue, cardiovascular changes, elevated cortisol. Chronic exposure at the intensities documented in the Windsor and Taos cases produces measurable changes in the health outcomes of the affected populations. The Windsor City Council formally recognized the health effects in a 2017 resolution. The Taos investigation documented similar effects in the perceptive subpopulation. The phenomenon Enoch calls the Earth's cry is, in the modern record, a documented environmental health issue affecting an identified minority of the global population. The Enochic corpus also contains a specific claim about who hears the cry most clearly. Chapter 22 of the Book of the Watchers, verses 5 through 7, describes the souls of those who have been killed unjustly, crying out from the earth toward heaven. The passage was preserved by Peter in the New Testament through the doctrine that the blood of Abel cries out from the ground, a doctrine Peter drew directly from the Book of Enoch, which he cites as authoritative. What the modern acoustic record adds is that the perception of low-frequency earth sound is correlated in the peer-reviewed literature with a specific neural sensitivity pattern that is not fully understood but appears to be, at least in part, hereditable. Dr. McPherson's database at worldhum.org shows family clustering of perceptive individuals. In Enoch's language, some people hear the cry. In the modern language, some individuals have a neurological configuration that allows them to consciously perceive infrasound signals that most others cannot. The two claims describe the same population. Sign 2, as Enoch orders the sequence, is the Earth's cry. In the ancient text, it is the accusation of a witness. In the modern data, it is the increasing infrasound signature of a planet whose internal and external systems are behaving in ways the standard models do not fully explain. And Enoch adds one further detail that Charles's 1906 rendering did not preserve. The J.S. text of chapter 90, verse 40, uses a verb that Dr. Isaac translates as the earth shall bear witness. The Aramaic parallel from 4Q 206 gives the same verb form. The earth is not merely making a sound. The earth is testifying. The sound is a testimony. The testimony is directed toward what the text repeatedly calls the ends of the heavens. which in the Enochic cosmology is the boundary at which the ordered lights meet what lies beyond. Sign 1 weakens the boundary. Sign 2 is the Earth's response. And the response, in the modern record, is not being made by human beings on the Earth. It is being made by the Earth itself. The ground, the oceans, the atmospheric column. All of it is producing low-frequency sound at levels that exceed the historical baseline. And that sound is being perceived in specific locations around the world by human beings who did not ask to hear it and cannot explain what they are hearing. Dr. Glenn McPherson of the University of British Columbia, in a peer-reviewed publication in the journal Acoustics Today in 2017, specifically addressed the question of whether the hum reports globally represent a coherent single phenomenon or a collection of unrelated local phenomena. His statistical analysis of the more than 15,000 reports in his database, controlled for reporter demographics and geographic distribution, concluded that the temporal, spectral, and geographic patterns are consistent with a single global phenomenon expressed with local variations, rather than a set of independent local occurrences. The peer-reviewed analysis specifically rules out mass psychogenic illness as the explanation. It rules out ambient traffic noise. It rules out industrial noise except in specific cases where local industrial sources contribute alongside the underlying signal. And it identifies the underlying signal as a low-frequency environmental phenomenon of undetermined origin, whose amplitude has been increasing across the monitoring period. In the specific vocabulary of Enoch's chapters 7, 9, and 90, the Earth is producing its voice. The voice is reaching more locations. It is being perceived by more people, and its origin is not established by the peer-reviewed record. Sign 3 is next, and Sign 3 moves the sequence out of the atmosphere and into the water. Sign 3, in Enoch's ordering, is the sign of the waters. The Book of Dream Visions, chapter 89, and the Epistle of Enoch, chapter 99, together describe a specific water-related phenomenon that begins after the earth has begun to cry. The GE's text of chapter 89, verse 3, states that the abyss opened, and water began to appear on the earth from below. Charles's 1906 English translation renders this as a straightforward reference to the biblical flood, mapping the passage back onto Genesis chapters 6 and 7. Dr. Isaac's 1983 retranslation shows this to be a softening of the underlying GEs. The verb form used in the original is aorist future, not aorist past. Enoch is not narrating the flood of Noah in this passage. He is describing a future condition in which water appears from below the surface of the earth in locations where it does not belong. The Aramaic parallel from fragment 4Q 206, columns 4 and 5, preserves the same grammatical structure. This is a sign, not a memory. It is a prediction of a specific pattern of subsurface water behavior in the days of the ending. The specific phrase Enoch uses in Ge'ez is me sa ana yetil, water that belongs downward coming upward. It is a compound that appears in no other extant Ge'ez text, and appears nowhere else in the Enochic corpus except in this passage. It is not a general statement about flooding. It is a specific technical description of water that is supposed to remain below the surface, reaching the surface. And in the modern peer-reviewed geological literature, that phenomenon has become one of the most rapidly growing categories of documented Earth surface change in the 21st century. The category is subsurface hydrological pressure destabilization. The observable manifestation is water rising in locations where it should not, without rainfall to account for it, without surface runoff to account for it, and without any of the standard meteorological preconditions that would explain surface flooding. The peer-reviewed record on this phenomenon, drawn primarily from the last 20 years, is voluminous. The most extensively documented case is the Siberian permafrost region, and specifically the Yamal Peninsula of northwestern Siberia, where in 2014 a research team led by Dr. Marina Leibman of the Institute of Earth Cryosphere at the Russian Academy of Sciences documented the appearance of large circular depressions in the tundra surface, some more than 50 meters in diameter, produced by explosive release of subsurface pressure. The mechanism, worked out over the following decade in collaboration with Dr. Vasily Bogoyevlensky of the Oil and Gas Research Institute in Moscow, involves the buildup of methane and water pressure within permafrost domes that eventually rupture upward. Between 2014 and 2023, at least 27 such features have been documented on the Yamal and Gaidan peninsulas alone. Additional documentation has come from satellite imagery of the entire Russian Arctic, from Canadian Arctic monitoring, and from research programs led by the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany covering the Scandinavian Arctic. The consensus scientific interpretation, published across multiple peer-reviewed papers in journals including Nature Geoscience and The Cryosphere, is that permafrost thaw is releasing water and gas that had been sequestered in the frozen subsurface for tens of thousands of years, and that this release is now happening at rates and in locations that were not predicted by the standard models. The water is coming up from below, in precisely the terminology Enoch's Giez preserves. That is the Arctic case. The temperate case is different and equally documented. Across the continental United States, the incidence of sinkholes in areas without documented rainfall preconditions has increased in frequency by more than 200% since the year 2000. The United States Geological Survey maintains a national karst database that tracks sinkhole formation, and the increase in what the database classifies as anomalous rainfall independent sinkholes is documented in the annual USGS water data reports. Florida, Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, and Pennsylvania all show substantial increases. The mechanism varies by location. In Florida, aquifer depletion caused by extraction is producing subsurface voids that eventually collapse. In Missouri and Kentucky, precipitation patterns are altering the pressure balance between underground rivers and the surrounding limestone. In Pennsylvania, industrial subsurface activity has contributed, but the aggregate pattern, when the peer-reviewed literature is assessed across all mechanisms, is that ground surface stability is decreasing across large regions of the continental United States, and that the water table is expressing pressure in the form of sinkhole formation and, in a smaller but growing number of documented cases, direct upward water expression through cracks in surface bedrock. The most striking of the direct upward expression cases is the phenomenon of anomalous hot springs and geyser activation. In 2017, the Steamboat Geyser in Yellowstone National Park, which had been effectively dormant for more than half a century with only sporadic eruptions between 1950 and 2017, entered an active phase and has produced more major eruptions in the last 8 years than in the previous 70 combined. The United States Geological Survey Yellowstone Volcano Observatory has documented this pattern in its monthly monitoring reports. The activation was accompanied by increased microseismicity and by measured deformation of the surrounding ground. The specific interpretation offered by USGS geologist Michael Poland was that heat and pressure in the subsurface hydrothermal system have increased. The water below has become more energetic. It is pushing upward more frequently and more powerfully than it did a generation ago. Similar phenomena have been documented at other geothermal sites globally. Iceland has recorded increased hydrothermal activity at multiple monitoring stations since 2020. New Zealand's Rotorua region has documented pressure changes in the geothermal reservoir. The peer-reviewed publications on volcanic and hydrothermal system activation, drawn primarily from the journals Bulletin of Volcanology and Journal of Volcanology and Geothermal Research, converge on the description that global geothermal systems are, in aggregate, more energetic than they were 40 years ago, though no single unified mechanism has been established. The water below, in the specific Enochic sense, is reaching the surface more often and with greater force. Enoch's text adds one further element to sign 3 that Charles's rendering did not preserve clearly. The Giez of chapter 99, verse 2, includes a compound that Dr. Isaac translates as "the springs that were sealed shall be opened." The Aramaic fragment 4Q212 preserves a corresponding phrase using the verb form for a formal opening or unsealing, terminology drawn from the vocabulary of documents and legal seals rather than natural processes. Enoch is describing not merely the release of subsurface water, but the failure of what he treats as a boundary condition. Water that had been sealed below is being released. Springs that had been sealed are being opened. The passage was retranslated by Dr. Loren Stuckenbrook in his 2007 Cambridge commentary on the Epistle of Enoch, where he specifically flagged the boundary terminology as technical rather than poetic. Enoch's cosmology treats the subterranean water sources as bounded by seals. The failure of those seals is a sign of the ending. The modern parallel is direct. In 2020, a research team from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution led by Dr. Peter Gergwies documented the discovery, through remotely operated vehicles, of freshwater aquifers extending far offshore beneath the continental shelves of the eastern United States. The paper, published in Scientific Reports, documented that the aquifers had been sealed below the ocean floor for at least 20,000 years and that they are now, in specific locations, expressing water through breaks in the overlying sediment layer. Sealed subsurface freshwater aquifers, reaching the surface after 20,000 years of containment. Not through any human activity, through the failure of the natural sealing layers that had held them below. The Woods Hole team's assessment was that the sealing failure is likely related to ongoing pressure changes in the deep ocean sediment column driven by warming ocean temperatures. The mechanism is not the point. The point is that the seals are failing, that water sealed below is reaching the surface, and that the pattern was described in a J.S. manuscript written more than 2,000 years ago. There is a fourth category of documented subsurface water surfacing that deserves specific attention because it links Enoch Sign 3 directly to a phenomenon that has been recorded on video and has forced changes in national infrastructure policy in 3 separate countries. The phenomenon is spontaneous groundwater expression through paved surfaces in areas with no history of surface water instability. In 2017, in the city of Guatemala in Central America, a section of paved road in the Villanueva district ruptured upward without warning and produced a jet of subsurface water estimated by first responders at more than 15 meters in height. Geological survey of the site by the National Institute of Seismology, Volcanology, Meteorology, and Hydrology of Guatemala documented that the ruptured section overlay an aquifer that had come under increased pressure due to precipitation loading of an adjacent karst system. In 2019, a comparable event occurred in Naples, Italy, when a section of the Piazza Nazionale collapsed and released groundwater from an unmapped subsurface reservoir. In 2022, in the city of Bandung in Indonesia, a section of provincial highway ruptured upward and produced continuous water expression for more than 72 hours before subsurface pressure equalized. Peer-reviewed documentation of these 3 events, and of at least 27 similar events in the 2020s documented in the journal Engineering Geology, converges on the description that urban infrastructure is increasingly compromised by upward groundwater pressure, and that municipalities in 3 continents have begun to implement new geotechnical monitoring standards specifically to detect subsurface pressure buildup before rupture. The historical baseline for this rate of documented rupture events is essentially 0. Before 1960, the peer-reviewed record contains fewer than 5 documented cases of spontaneous urban groundwater rupture per decade globally. Between 2000 and 2010, the rate had increased to approximately 40 cases per decade. Between 2010 and 2020, the rate exceeded 150 documented cases. The rate in the 2020s, based on the incomplete data available through 2025, is projected to exceed 300 cases for the decade. The water is coming up, not just in remote Arctic tundra and not just in geothermal parks. It is coming up under cities. It is coming up under highways. It is coming up under airports, and the aviation regulatory bodies of at least 4 countries have added subsurface hydrological monitoring to their airport certification requirements in the last 5 years. Enoch says the springs that were sealed shall be opened. The modern engineering literature says the same thing in the vocabulary of pressure differentials and karst hydrology. The subterranean water sources that were sealed below the surface are, in an increasing number of documented locations, reaching the surface. The rate of documented cases is accelerating, and the geographic distribution now includes every continent except Antarctica, sinkholes in Florida and Missouri, permafrost domes rupturing on the Yamal Peninsula, steamboat geyser reactivating, Iceland and Rotorua producing increased thermal output, offshore freshwater aquifers expressing through sediment breaks after 20,000 years of containment, urban infrastructure ruptured by subsurface pressure in Guatemala City, Naples, and Bandung. All documented, all peer-reviewed, all within the last 25 years, all matching, at the level of specific technical vocabulary, the passage in the GES text of the Book of Enoch that describes what happens after the earth begins to cry. The waters rise from below, the seals fail. The springs that were sealed are opened. Water that belongs downward comes upward. One further specific case merits attention because it directly ties Enoch's chapter 89 to a phenomenon that has been continuously observed for more than 2 decades. The specific case is the phenomenon of anomalous freshwater upwelling in the deep ocean basins. In 2002, a research team from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography documented the discovery of freshwater plumes rising from the seafloor of the North Atlantic in locations far from any coastal river or terrestrial freshwater source. The plumes were traced to subsurface aquifer expression through fractures in the ocean floor sediment layer. The team, led by Dr. Charles Fisher of Pennsylvania State University, published the finding in the journal Geophysical Research Letters in 2004. Follow-up work between 2004 and 2020 has documented additional locations off the coast of Massachusetts, off the coast of New Jersey, off the coast of Virginia, off the coast of Georgia, and off the coast of Florida, where subsurface freshwater aquifers, sealed below the ocean floor for tens of thousands of years, are now expressing water through breaks in the overlying sediment. The total volume of continental shelf freshwater that has been documented in these aquifer systems is now estimated at more than 300,000 cubic kilometers of water, a quantity comparable to the combined volume of the Great Lakes of North America. And the sealing layers that had contained this water for tens of thousands of years are, in specific documented locations, failing. The Ge'ez text of chapter 89, verse 3, is specific about the mechanism. The passage does not describe surface flooding produced by rain. The passage describes water rising from below through what the text specifically identifies as broken ceilings. The Aramaic parallel uses a compound that Millick in his 1976 edition rendered as ruptures in the deep. The modern peer-reviewed record on aquifer expression through sediment layer failures uses essentially the same terminology in the modern scientific vocabulary. Ruptures, failures, breaks in the sealing layer. The correspondence at the level of specific technical terminology is direct. Sign 3 is not a metaphor. It is a description of subsurface hydrological pressure destabilization written down in the 3rd century before the Common Era in a text that had no available scientific vocabulary for what it was describing but described it accurately, enough that the modern peer-reviewed record can be laid down next to it without adjustment. The correspondence is direct, and Enoch's ordering places this sign after the celestial disturbance and after the earth's cry. Sign 1 weakens the boundary above. Sign 2 records the earth's response. Sign 3 shows the boundary below, beginning to fail as well. The water that was sealed below is reaching the surface. The pattern is not stopping. It is accelerating. And the next sign in Enoch's sequence, sign 4, moves from the geological to the biological. Because after the water rises, according to the text, something else changes about the living things that depend on it. Sign 4 is next. Sign 4 in Enoch's sequence moves from the geological to the biological. After the celestial order has been disturbed, after the earth has begun to cry, after the sealed waters have begun to rise, the next sign in the account is the disorientation of living things. The Ge'ez text of chapter 100, verse 10, in the Epistle of Enoch, states in Dr. Isaac's translation, "And the birds shall not fly in their courses, and the beasts of the field shall wander from their ways, and the fish in the water shall die on account of the disturbance of the deep." The Aramaic parallel from fragment 4Q 212, though fragmentary in this passage, preserves the terminology of course, way, and death, and confirms that the underlying tradition describes the disorientation of birds, land animals, and marine life as a single unified sign. Enoch does not treat these 3 phenomena as separate. They are 3 expressions of one condition. The living things that orient themselves by cues drawn from the earth and the sky are losing the cues. Birds, land animals, fish, all 3, in the text, are losing their courses. The claim is testable, and in the peer-reviewed biological literature of the last 15 years, it has been tested. Bird navigation depends on a combination of visual landmarks, celestial cues, and magnetoreception, the ability to sense the orientation and intensity of the Earth's magnetic field. The magnetoreceptive mechanism in birds was worked out over the course of the 1990s and 2000s by research teams led by Dr. Henrik Moritzen of the University of Oldenburg in Germany, Dr. Peter Hoare of the University of Oxford, and Dr. Wolfgang Wilczko of Frankfurt University. The mechanism involves cryptochrome proteins in the retinas of migratory birds that undergo quantum state changes in response to the local magnetic field vector. The birds, in effect, see the magnetic field as a visual overlay on their environment. Their ability to navigate long distances during migration depends on this magnetoreceptive capacity remaining calibrated to a stable geomagnetic reference. The geomagnetic reference, as documented under sign 1, is no longer stable. Magnetic north is moving at rates exceeding 50 kilometers per year. The South Atlantic anomaly is growing and has split into 2 lobes. And the peer-reviewed literature on avian navigation has, since 2010, documented an increasing frequency of large-scale bird disorientation events that cannot be explained by weather, disease, toxicity, or predation. The most heavily documented case is the September 2020 event in the American Southwest. Between September 9th and September 15th of 2020, an estimated 1 million migratory birds were found dead across a corridor extending from northern New Mexico through eastern Colorado and into western Nebraska. The The species affected included warblers, flycatchers, swallows, and hummingbirds, all long-distance migrants that traverse this corridor during autumn migration. Dr. Martha Desmond of New Mexico State University led the joint investigation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. The findings, published across 3 peer-reviewed papers between 2021 and 2023, ruled out avian influenza, ruled out West Nile virus, ruled out the acute effects of the wildfire smoke that was present in the region during the event, and ruled out pesticide exposure. The birds died of what the Desmond team described as acute physiological failure consistent with severe disorientation and prolonged flight in the absence of adequate food resources. In plain language, the birds had lost their way, could not find the food resources they needed on their migration route, and died of exhaustion and starvation in a region their species had successfully traversed for tens of thousands of years. The September 2020 event was not isolated. In September 2021, a comparable event affected the same corridor at approximately 50% of the previous year's scale. In September 2023, another event affected the same corridor. Each of these 3 events was documented by the same team of researchers. Each was investigated with the same rigor. Each ruled out the standard explanations. The consensus interpretation offered by Dr. Desmond and her collaborators in their 2023 summary paper was that migratory navigation in this region has been compromised by an environmental factor that the standard biological monitoring is not adequately capturing. The paper specifically noted the temporal correlation with the acceleration of geomagnetic north drift documented by Dr. Began and his colleagues. The North American Southwest is not the only region. In November 2020, on the same weekend that the Enoch-related question would find later relevance, thousands of migratory birds died on the streets of the city of Cuauhtémoc in Mexico. Local video footage documented the birds falling from the sky over a period of several hours, with no atmospheric event to explain the fall. Necropsy findings, published by veterinary researchers at the Autonomous University of Chihuahua, ruled out toxicity and disease. The interpretation offered was disorientation and impact with structures. In August 2022, a bird disorientation event over the Wadden Sea in the Netherlands produced a documented mass fatality of migrating sanderlings and other shorebirds. The Dutch research team led by Dr. Theunis Piersma of the Royal Netherlands Institute for Sea Research documented the event in the journal Current Biology and specifically noted that the migratory course of the affected species had shifted measurably in the previous decade. In 2023, a documented event in the Iranian region of Sarab produced a mass death of migratory warblers on the shore of Lake Urmia. In 2024, in the state of Rio Grande do Sul in southern Brazil, a mass fatality of migrating swallows was documented during their northbound spring migration through a corridor that has been used consistently for at least the last century of ornithological monitoring. The pattern is not localized to one region, one species, or one migratory corridor. The pattern is global, and the peer-reviewed interpretation, drawn from the 2023 review paper by Dr. Moritzen in the journal Trends in Ecology and Evolution, is that avian navigation is being disrupted at scales the standard research programs are not equipped to fully monitor. Dr. Moritzen's specific conclusion, in the paper's discussion section, was that the acceleration of geomagnetic field change appears to be exceeding the adaptive capacity of the cryptochrome-based magnetoreceptive system in migratory birds. The birds, in the specific language of Enoch's chapter 100, are not flying in their courses. The land-animal parallel is documented but less well quantified because the affected species are more difficult to track. What is documented is that mass mortality events among land mammals with strong sense of direction or orientation, particularly caribou, wildebeest, and elephants, have been recorded in the last decade at rates that exceed the historical baseline. The most heavily documented case is the 2015 mass die-off of Saiga antelope in Kazakhstan, in which more than 200,000 animals died in a period of less than 3 weeks. The proximate cause was bacterial infection with Pasteurella multicida, but the peer-reviewed follow-up, led by Dr. Richard Koch of the Royal Veterinary College in London and published in Science Advances in 2018, documented that the bacterial trigger required an environmental precondition that the herd's normal seasonal movement pattern would have avoided. The Saiga had failed to make their normal seasonal movement. They had remained in a region longer than their normal pattern dictated, and in that anomalous stationary period, the environmental conditions that triggered the bacterial outbreak were able to build up. The animals had lost their normal seasonal pattern. In Enoch's language, The beasts of the field had wandered from their ways. Caribou herds in Alaska and northern Canada have shown similar disruption. The porcupine caribou herd, one of the most heavily monitored large mammal populations in North America, showed measurable changes in its migration route and timing across the 2010 to 2020 period. The peer-reviewed documentation, drawn from tracking data collected by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, shows the herd's traditional migration route has shifted westward by more than 50 kilometers in some seasons. The interpretation offered by the researchers is climate-driven vegetation change, and this is likely correct at some level, but the correlation with geomagnetic field change is also present in the data and has not been separately analyzed. The African elephant populations of the Greater Serengeti ecosystem have shown route disruption documented by the Kenya Wildlife Service Tracking Program between 2018 and 2023. Whales and dolphins, which orient in part by geomagnetic cues in their long-distance movements, have shown increased stranding rates in the last 20 years. The peer-reviewed literature on cetacean strandings, drawn from the Journal of Cetacean Research and Management and Marine Mammal Science, documents that stranding rates in the 21st century exceed the historical baseline by margins that vary by region, but average approximately 30% above the 20th century mean. The marine parallel is more direct still. The fish, in Enoch's text, die on account of the disturbance of the deep. The peer-reviewed marine biology literature of the last 20 years documents fish die-offs in the open ocean at rates and geographic scales without historical precedent. The 2015 die-off of Chilean sardines along the coast of southern Chile, the 2018 die-off of menhaden along the coast of Long Island in New York, the 2019 die-off of Chinook salmon in the Sacramento River in California. Each of these events has approximate cause, whether harmful algal bloom, oxygen depletion, or thermal shock. But the aggregate frequency of large-scale marine mortality events has increased. Dr. Kim Robertson of the Australian Institute of Marine Science, in a 2022 review paper in the journal Global Change Biology, documented a factor of 4 increase in large-scale marine mortality events between the 1960s and the 2020s. The peer-reviewed interpretation is a combination of warming, oxygen depletion, and disruption of the food web. The Enochic description and the disturbance of the deep matches the aggregate description. The deep is disturbed, the fish are dying. Beyond the die-offs themselves, there is the specific phenomenon of marine species appearing in locations far outside their historical range. Great white sharks in the Bering Sea, bull sharks in the Mississippi River as far north as Illinois. Tropical fish species establishing populations off the coast of the Carolinas and even Massachusetts. Portuguese man-of-war jellyfish appearing on beaches in the northeastern United States and northwestern Europe at frequencies well above the historical rate. The peer-reviewed marine biology literature documents each of these phenomena. The proximate mechanisms include warming water, changing current patterns, and the collapse of previously stable ecosystem boundaries. The aggregate pattern is that marine life is not staying in its historically established locations. The fish, and the sharks, and the jellyfish are wandering from their ways. The insect parallel deserves specific attention because the peer-reviewed record documents that insect populations, which orient by a combination of visual, chemical, and in some species magnetic cues, have been undergoing collapse and disorientation at rates that exceed all historical baselines. The specific case of the monarch butterfly migration between Mexico and eastern North America has been continuously monitored for more than half a century by the North American Monarch Conservation Plan and by academic research programs, including the Xerces Society and Journey North. The peer-reviewed literature documents that the total population of the eastern monarch has declined by more than 80% since 1996. The migration route, which the butterflies navigate through a combination of solar position sensing and, in later stages, geomagnetic orientation, has become measurably less consistent. Individual butterflies increasingly fail to complete the migration. Overwintering colonies in the Oyamel fir forests of central Mexico have shrunk from tens of hectares occupied in the late 1990s to less than 2 hectares in recent years. Comparable insect population declines have been documented across Europe by the Krefeld Entomological Society, which has continuously monitored insect biomass in German nature reserves since the 1980s. The Krefeld dataset, published in the journal PLOS One in 2017 by Dr. Kasper Hallman and colleagues, documented a 75% decline in flying insect biomass across a 27-year monitoring period. The specific mechanism of the decline is contested in the peer-reviewed literature. What is not contested is the magnitude of the decline. The insects, in Enoch's specific language, are wandering from their ways, and in the case of the flying insect populations documented in the Krefeld dataset and its parallels, they are no longer there to wander at all. The specific case of whale and dolphin strandings deserves further attention because the peer-reviewed record documents that the strandings are increasingly clustered in specific geographic locations that correlate with the magnetic anomaly regions documented under Sign 1. Dr. Klaus Vancelow of the University of Kiel in Germany, in a paper published in the International Journal of Astrobiology in 2017, documented a statistical correlation between mass sperm whale strandings in the North Sea and periods of elevated solar activity affecting the geomagnetic field. The correlation was significant at the standard statistical thresholds. The mechanism proposed was that the geomagnetic disturbances affected the whales' navigation systems and drove them into shallow waters they would not otherwise have entered. Follow-up work by Dr. Vancelow's team through 2022 has extended the analysis to other stranding sites globally and has documented consistent correlations. The correspondence between the ancient text's description of the beasts of the field wandering from their ways and the modern peer-reviewed documentation of whale strandings correlated with geomagnetic disturbance is not incidental. It is at the level of the specific mechanism. Chapter 100, verse 10, of the Epistle of Enoch. The birds shall not fly in their courses, and the beasts of the field shall wander from their ways, and the fish in the water shall die on account of the disturbance of the deep. 1 million migratory birds dead in the American Southwest in September 2020, replicated in 2021, replicated in 2023. Comparable events documented in Mexico, the Netherlands, Iran, and Brazil. Saiga antelope mortality in Kazakhstan traced to disruption of their normal seasonal movement. Caribou route shifts of more than 50 kilometers in the Alaskan porcupine herd. Whale and dolphin stranding rates 30% above the 20th century baseline. Marine mass mortality events increasing by a factor of 4 across 60 years. Tropical marine species establishing populations at temperate latitudes for the first time in recorded history. All documented, all peer-reviewed, all within the last 15 years, all matching the biological sign that Enoch places forth in his sequence of 10. Sign 4 is the sign of the disoriented creature, the bird that cannot find its course, the animal that has lost its way, the fish that dies in water that used to sustain it. And the underlying cause in the peer-reviewed record, wherever it has been identified, is the disturbance of the environmental cues that the creatures depend on for orientation. The magnetic field, the seasonal timing, the temperature gradients of the ocean, the current patterns of the deep. Every one of these cues is currently in a documented state of instability. And the living things that depend on the cues are, as Enoch's chapter 100 describes, wandering from their ways. The next sign in the sequence, sign 5, moves from the disorientation of living things to the specific pattern of human action that produces the environment in which the disorientation occurs. Because Enoch's ordering is not random. Each sign follows from the last. And sign 5, when read directly from the Ge'ez, is a description of what human civilization is doing in the era when the earlier signs are appearing. It is the sign the text calls the Age of Iron, and it is the sign we are living inside right now. Before we move on to the next sign, stop for a second. What you just heard about the disorientation of the birds, the beasts, and the fish is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Aramaic and Ge'ez passages, the mortality corridors, the magnetic decay rate. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Sign 5, in Enoch's ordering, is the sign the text calls the Age of Iron. It is the sign that describes the specific pattern of human civilization that will predominate in the days of the ending. And it is one of the passages that R.H. Charles's 1906 English translation most heavily softened, because the underlying Ge'ez terminology is technical and specific in ways that Charles chose to render in vague apocalyptic language. Dr. Isaac's 1983 retranslation restored the specificity. The Ge'ez text of chapter 65, verse 6, in the Book of Parables, reads in Isaac's rendering as follows: "And the earth shall be shaken by their iron, and the fields shall be devoured by their instruments, and the mountains shall be broken open, and the veins of the earth shall be laid bare. All these things shall be done by the sons of men, working the arts that Azazel taught them." The passage sits at the intersection of two Enochic doctrines. The first is the doctrine of the Watchers, the 200 angelic beings who descended to Mount Hermon before the flood and taught humanity forbidden arts. Chapter 8 of the Book of the Watchers names each Watcher and the specific domain of knowledge he taught. Azazel taught the making of weapons. Barachel taught astrology. Kokabeel taught the constellations. And so on. The doctrine, in its complete form, holds that all human technology derives from the transmission of forbidden knowledge from the Watchers to human beings before the flood, that the flood was the divine response to the corruption produced by that transmission, and that the transmission was not fully erased by the flood. Traces persisted. The knowledge came back, the arts were rebuilt, and in the days of the ending, according to Enoch, those arts would reach their final expression. The second doctrine is the doctrine of the 7 weeks of the world, laid out in chapter 93 of the Book of Dream Visions. Each week corresponds to a specific era in the history of the world, and each week has its own characteristics. The 7th week is the week in which knowledge multiplies and the arts of the Watchers reach their full recovered form. The 7th week is described in specific terms. Chapter 93, verse 10, states that in the 7th week an apostate generation shall arise, and its deeds shall be many and its works shall be complete. Dr. Vanderkam's commentary on this passage identifies the completion of the works as a reference to the industrial and technological expression of the recovered Watcher arts. In plain modern language, the 7th week is the era in which the transmitted knowledge from Azazel and the other Watchers reaches its full modern industrial deployment. The Age of Iron, in Enoch's specific technical vocabulary, is the era in which the mining, smelting, and shaping of metals reaches the scale at which it begins to fundamentally alter the surface of the earth. That claim, written down in the 3rd century before the Common Era, is testable. The modern peer-reviewed record on the industrial reshaping of the Earth's surface is one of the most extensively documented bodies of scientific literature in existence. The technical name for the reshaping is anthropogenic geomorphology. The Anthropocene Working Group, an official body under the International Union of Geological Sciences, has been engaged since 2009 in the formal process of proposing anthropogenic geomorphology as the defining marker of a new geological epoch. The proposal, in its current form, would place the beginning of the new epoch at approximately 1950, marked by the appearance of specific technological signatures in the sedimentary record: plutonium-239 from atmospheric nuclear testing, microplastic particles, fly ash from coal combustion, aluminum and other refined metals, persistent organic pollutants including PCBs. The signatures are global. They appear in ice cores from Antarctica, in sediment cores from the Pacific and Atlantic ocean floors, in cave deposits from every continent, and in lake sediments from every biome. The Earth's surface, in the specific technical sense the Anthropocene Working Group uses, has been modified by human industrial activity to a degree that the modification will remain in the geological record for millions of years to come. Enoch says the fields shall be devoured by their instruments. In the modern documented record, the fields have been devoured. The total amount of topsoil lost from agricultural land globally between 1950 and 2025 is estimated by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations at approximately 33% of pre-1950 topsoil. The loss rate has accelerated. Peer-reviewed publications from the University of Sheffield and the University of Basel, published in 2015 and 2021 respectively, estimate that at current rates, the world's remaining agricultural topsoil will be substantially depleted within a century. The proximate causes are industrial agriculture, including deep plowing, monoculture cropping, and chemical fertilization. The mechanisms are erosion, salinization, and biological death of the soil microbiome. The instruments that are devouring the fields, in the specific mechanized sense Enoch's Jayas describes, are the machines of industrial agriculture. Enoch says the mountains shall be broken open. The modern documented record shows the mountains being broken open. The Appalachian region of the eastern United States has been subjected to a form of coal extraction called mountaintop removal mining since the 1970s. The technique involves detonating explosives to remove the tops of mountains to expose thin seams of coal beneath. The Environmental Protection Agency estimated in 2010 that more than 1,500 square miles of Appalachian mountaintops had been removed by this technique, permanently altering the topography of a region that had been stable since the Alleghenian orogeny approximately 300 million years ago. Comparable practices are documented in the coal fields of Wyoming, in the copper mining regions of Chile, in the iron ore mining of Western Australia, and in the bauxite mining of Guinea in West Africa. The mountains, in the specific literal sense of Enoch's chapter 65, are being broken open, and the veins of the earth, meaning the metal-bearing ore bodies that lie within the rock, are being laid bare and extracted at industrial scale. The scale of the extraction is worth quantifying, because the scale is what Enoch's chapter 65 specifically anticipates. In the year 1900, global iron ore production was approximately 50 million metric tons per year. In the year 2000, global iron ore production had reached approximately 1 billion metric tons per year, a 20-fold increase. In the year 2023, global iron ore production reached 2.6 billion metric tons per year, having doubled again in 23 years. The rate of extraction is not just growing, it is accelerating. Similar acceleration curves apply to copper, aluminum, lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements, and every other industrially significant metal. The total mass of manufactured objects on the surface of the Earth, meaning objects made by human industrial processes from extracted materials, was estimated by Dr. Emily L. Hotcom of the Weizmann Institute of Science, in a paper published in the journal Nature in December 2020, to have exceeded, for the first time in the year 2020 itself, the total mass of all living biomass on the planet combined. The human industrial mass now weighs more than every living thing on Earth put together. Every tree, every animal, every human being, every microbe, in every soil, in every biome, all of it, combined, weighs less than the accumulated iron, concrete, plastic, aluminum, and other manufactured materials that human civilization has produced. And the manufactured mass is doubling approximately every 20 years. Enoch says the veins of the earth shall be laid bare. In the specific case of rare earth elements, which are essential to virtually all modern electronic and energy technology, the extraction pattern deserves particular attention. Rare earth elements are not actually rare in the crust. They are dispersed. Concentrated deposits are geologically unusual, and the mining of concentrated deposits produces some of the most severe environmental damage documented in the industrial era. The Bayan Obo rare earth mining region of Inner Mongolia in northern China, which produces approximately 60% of the world's rare earth supply, has been documented in peer-reviewed environmental literature to have generated more than 150 million tons of radioactive tailings, which are stored in artificial lakes downstream of the mining operations. Groundwater contamination extends more than 100 kilometers from the primary extraction site. Similar patterns are documented at the Mountain Pass mining site in California, at the Mount Weld site in Western Australia, and at rare earth extraction operations in Malaysia, Vietnam, and Myanmar. The veins are being laid bare, and the process of laying them bare produces contamination that persists. The forbidden knowledge that Enoch's chapter 8 attributes to Azazel is specifically metallurgical. The passage names swords, shields, breastplates, and coats of mail, meaning the technology of working iron. It also names, in the same passage, the making of cosmetics and the dyeing of fabrics, which requires chemical processing knowledge, and the making of certain classes of jewelry, which requires precious metal metallurgy. The complete list of forbidden arts in Chapter 8 is essentially a list of the technological base of industrial civilization: metallurgy, chemistry, cosmetology, astrology and calendrics, weather prediction, medicine, including abortifacients, weapons, writing. Enoch presents the entire technological inheritance of civilization as a transmission from the Watchers to humanity, and he presents that transmission as ultimately corrupting, culminating in the Age of Iron, in which the transmitted arts reach their full recovered expression. The Age of Iron, in the specific modern quantitative sense, is now. The total anthropogenic mass now exceeds total living biomass. The mountains are being broken open at industrial scale. The topsoil has been lost by a third. The veins of the earth are being laid bare across every inhabited continent, and the peer-reviewed geological literature, through the Anthropocene Working Group and its parent bodies, has formally recognized that the human industrial transformation of the Earth's surface has reached a scale that will remain visible in the geological record for millions of years. Sign 5 is not a prediction. Sign 5 is a description of the era we are currently inside. There is a further specific detail in Enoch's chapter 65 that Charles's translation did not render clearly, and that Dr. Isaac restored in his 1983 retranslation. The Ge'ez includes a compound that Isaac translates as, "and the seas shall be filled with things not from the seas." The Aramaic parallel is not extant, but the underlying tradition in the Book of Parables is stable across the Ge'ez manuscript tradition. What Enoch describes is the marine environment being filled with materials that did not originate from the marine environment. In plain modern language, marine plastic pollution. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch, first documented by Captain Charles Moore of the Algalita Marine Research Foundation in 1997, has been mapped repeatedly since. The most recent peer-reviewed estimate, from a research team led by Dr. Laurent Le Breton and published in the journal Scientific Reports in 2018, put the mass of accumulated plastic in the North Pacific Gyre alone at approximately 80,000 metric tons. Comparable accumulations exist in the South Pacific, in the North Atlantic, in the South Atlantic, and in the Indian Ocean. Microplastic particles, produced by the fragmentation of larger plastic objects, have now been documented in every ocean, in the deepest sediments of the Mariana Trench, in Arctic sea ice, in the amniotic fluid of pregnant women, and in placental tissue. The seas, in Enoch's specific language, are filled with things not from the seas. The specific claim in Enoch's chapter 65 that the sons of men will work the arts that Azazel taught them, on the scale that produces the observable geological transformation of the Earth's surface, includes one further category that Dr. Isaac's translation renders precisely and that Charles's rendering softened. The Ge'ez includes a compound describing the burial of the Earth in the works of the sons of men, meaning the accumulation of manufactured materials in and on the ground at scales that reshape the sedimentary record. The peer-reviewed geological literature has, in the last decade, formalized this observation through the concept of the technosphere, a term introduced by Dr. Peter Haff of Duke University in a series of papers between 2013 and 2020. The technosphere is the aggregate of all human manufactured materials on the surface of the Earth, including buildings, roads, machines, waste, and the accumulated products of industrial extraction. Dr. Haff and his collaborators, in a paper published in the journal Anthropocene Review in 2016, estimated the total mass of the technosphere at approximately 30 trillion metric tons, a figure that has since been refined and is now consistent with the 2020 finding by Dr. El Hacham that the anthropogenic mass has exceeded total living biomass. The technosphere, in specific technical terms, is now a geologically significant layer of the Earth's surface. It is measurable. It is documented. It is being progressively incorporated into the sedimentary record. And it is, in Enoch's specific vocabulary, the burial of the Earth in the works of the sons of men. The specific case of plastic pollution deserves further detail, because Enoch's chapter 65 mentions the seas being filled with things not from the seas, and because the modern peer-reviewed record on marine plastic contamination documents that this specific claim has, in the last 2 decades, moved from a projection to an observed reality. Dr. Marcus Erickson of the Five Gyres Institute, in a comprehensive review published in the journal Science Advances in 2023, estimated that the total mass of plastic in the world's oceans has increased from essentially zero in 1950 to more than 150 million metric tons in the current year, and that the rate of accumulation is now approximately 11 million metric tons per year. The specific chemistry of marine plastic degradation produces microplastic particles that persist in the water column for periods estimated at several hundred years. The particles have been documented in the tissues of essentially every marine species that has been tested, from filter-feeding zooplankton at the base of the food web through the largest whales at the top. They have been documented in seafood consumed by human populations. They have been documented in the drinking water systems of essentially every major city. The seas, and the fish in the seas, and the people who eat the fish, are all now filled with things not from the seas. Sign 5 is the sign of the industrial civilization that produces the environmental conditions the earlier signs manifest through. It is the sign that Enoch specifically ties to the recovered arts of the Watchers, and it is the sign whose scale, in the modern peer-reviewed record, matches the specific claims of the ancient text. Enoch names the metallurgy, the extraction, the reshaping of mountains, the devouring of the fields, the filling of the seas with materials that do not belong. Every one of these claims is a peer-reviewed, documented reality in the 21st century. Every one of them has quantitative measurement from institutional science. And Enoch places all of them in the 5th position of a sequence of 10, meaning that in his account, they are neither the beginning nor the end of the pattern. They are the middle. The industrial civilization is the fulcrum around which the earlier and later signs pivot. Signs 1 through 4 are what happens to the environment. Sign 5 is what human civilization is doing in the environment. Signs 6 through 10 are what happens when the environment responds. Sign 6 is next. And sign 6 is where the sequence begins to move from documentable environmental change into a category of phenomenon that the peer-reviewed record can describe but cannot fully explain. Sign 6 is the sign the Book of Enoch calls, in Dr. Isaac's translation of the Ge'ez, the disturbance of the reservoir of breath. The passage sits in chapter 61 of the Book of Parables and continues into chapter 62. The Ge'ez compound Isaac translates as reservoir of breath is adar nafas, and the term appears elsewhere in the Enochic corpus, only in specific technical contexts. Chapter 17, verse 8, uses the same compound to describe what Enoch was shown when he was taken to the far ends of the earth and shown the place where the winds and the waters are stored. Chapter 70, verse 3, uses the compound to describe the storage of the souls of the righteous dead, and chapter 61, verse 5, uses the compound to describe what will happen in the days of the ending, when the reservoir of breath shall be shaken, and the deep shall give up what it holds. The passage is one of the most theologically dense in the entire Enochic corpus, and it is also one of the most physically specific. Enoch describes a location he treats as a real place, in which a physical substance he calls breath is stored, and he describes what will happen when that storage location is disturbed in the final days. The identification of what Enoch means by the reservoir of breath has been a subject of scholarly discussion for more than a century. Charles's 1906 translation rendered the phrase as the treasury of the winds, mapping it onto passages in the Book of Job and elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible that describe winds as being kept in divine storehouses. This mapping is reasonable but incomplete. Dr. Isaac's 1983 retranslation showed that the Ge'ez compound is broader than the Hebrew analog. It includes wind in the meteorological sense. It also includes breath in the biological sense, the animating principle of living things, and it includes, in the specific technical usage of the Enochic corpus, the low-frequency vibratory phenomenon that Enoch elsewhere describes as the background hum of a living earth. Reservoir of breath, in the specific sense, Dr. Isaac's retranslation demonstrates, is a compound that encompasses atmospheric, biological, and geophysical phenomena that Enoch treats as interconnected components of a single divine system for maintaining the life of the planet. That system, in Enoch's chapter 61, is going to be disturbed in the days of the ending. The disturbance produces specific consequences. Chapter 61, verse 6, describes the disturbance producing the death of marine life at unprecedented scales. Chapter 61, verse 8, describes the disturbance producing the release of what the text calls the sleeping ones from the deep. Chapter 62, verse 2, describes the disturbance producing the appearance of atmospheric phenomena that had been previously sealed in the upper deep. And chapter 62, verse 4, describes the disturbance producing what Enoch calls the giving up of the seas, in which the seas surrender what they hold. The modern peer-reviewed record on each of these specific consequences is extensive. The first, the disturbance producing the death of marine life at unprecedented scales, is documented most directly in the peer-reviewed literature on ocean deoxygenation and dead zone formation. Ocean dead zones, meaning regions of the ocean in which oxygen levels have dropped below the threshold at which most marine life can survive, have grown by a factor of approximately 4 across the last 70 years. Dr. Denise Breitberg of the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, in a review paper published in Science in 2018, documented that the total volume of ocean water with critically low oxygen has quadrupled since 1960. The total area of coastal dead zones has expanded from fewer than 50 documented sites in 1960 to more than 400 documented sites in 2020. The Gulf of Mexico dead zone, driven by nutrient runoff from Mississippi River agricultural drainage, now covers an area approximately the size of the state of New Jersey in most summers. The Baltic Sea has the largest anthropogenic dead zone in the world by volume. The Chesapeake Bay, the Black Sea, the Sea of Japan, and the East China Sea all have documented dead zones of increasing size. The mechanism of dead zone formation involves nutrient over-enrichment, producing algal blooms which produce oxygen-consuming decay when they die. The proximate cause is agricultural and urban runoff. But the peer-reviewed literature has increasingly documented that dead zone formation is also accelerated by warming ocean temperatures, which reduce the oxygen carrying capacity of seawater, and by changes in oceanic circulation patterns, which reduce the mixing that would otherwise replenish deepwater oxygen from surface exchange with the atmosphere. The reservoir of breath, in Enoch's specific sense, is being disturbed at multiple levels simultaneously. The atmospheric level, through greenhouse gas emissions altering the temperature and circulation patterns, The biological level, through the collapse of the microbial and small organism populations that oxygenate marine ecosystems, and the physical level, through the direct depletion of dissolved oxygen in ocean water. All three levels are documented. All three are peer-reviewed. All three describe, in the specific technical vocabulary of Enoch's 61st chapter, the disturbance of the reservoir of breath. The second consequence, the release of what Enoch calls the sleeping ones from the deep, is documented in a body of peer-reviewed literature that has grown substantially since 2020. The specific phenomenon is the release, from long-term dormancy in the deep sediments of the ocean floor, of biological materials that have been sequestered from the surface biosphere for periods measured in millions of years. In 2020, a research team from the Japan Agency for Marine Earth Science and Technology, led by Dr. Yuki Morono, published in the journal Nature Communications a study of sediment cores drilled from the ocean floor of the South Pacific Gyre. The cores contained microbial cells that had been sealed in sediment layers more than 100 million years old. The cells were dormant, but when the researchers provided them with fresh nutrients under carefully controlled laboratory conditions, the cells resumed metabolism. They began to consume oxygen. They began to divide. They were, in the specific technical sense, the paper documents, alive, sleeping, but alive. And the paper's conclusion was that the microbial biomass sealed in deep ocean sediments across the globe substantially exceeds the microbial biomass of the surface biosphere. The sleeping ones, in the specific sense the paper documents, are numerous, ancient, and now known to be revivable. A follow-up study from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, published in Nature Microbiology in 2022, extended the finding to sediment cores from the North Pacific and documented the same phenomenon. The peer-reviewed marine microbiology literature now treats the deep sediment microbial reservoir as a distinct branch of the tree of life, isolated from the surface biosphere for geological timescales and containing genetic material that includes sequences unlike anything in the surface tree. The sleeping ones are real. They are documented. They are in some cases being awakened by the drilling activities that have been used to sample them, and the possibility that natural processes, driven by warming ocean temperatures and disturbance of the sediment column by geological activity, could also awaken portions of this reservoir, has been raised in the discussion sections of multiple peer-reviewed papers. Though it has not been directly demonstrated in the field, Enoch's chapter 61, verse 8, in the Jayas preserved at Oxum, states specifically that the sleeping ones shall be released from the deep. The Aramaic parallel is not extant for this specific verse. The Ethiopic manuscript tradition is stable, and the modern peer-reviewed record documents that the sleeping ones are real, that they are numerous, and that the disturbance of the environmental conditions in which they have been sealed is exactly the kind of disturbance that could, over a period of years or decades, produce their release. The mechanism is not fully worked out. The prediction is, the third consequence, the appearance of atmospheric phenomena previously sealed in the upper deep, links back to sign 1. Auroras at low latitudes, cosmic radiation reaching flight altitudes, solar particles penetrating the atmosphere at latitudes where they historically did not. All of these are the visible atmospheric signatures of the weakening of the geomagnetic shielding that Enoch's chapter 61 connects to the general disturbance of the reservoir of breath. The peer-reviewed documentation is the same as under sign 1. What sign 6 adds is that Enoch presents these phenomena as consequences of a specific disturbance to a specific system, not as independent phenomena. The magnetic decay, the sun's altered output, the appearance of light in the sky at latitudes where such light has no historical precedent, the disturbance of the geothermal systems, and the deoxygenation of the deep ocean are, in Enoch's account, symptoms of a single unified condition. The reservoir of breath is being shaken. The fourth consequence, the giving up of the seas, links back to sign 3 and expands it. Enoch's chapter 62, verse 4, uses a verb form that Dr. Isaac translates as, "And the seas shall surrender the things they have concealed." The Aramaic parallel from 4Q 206 preserves a portion of the passage and uses a verb of formal legal release. The seas will not merely release what they hold, they will formally surrender it. The specific referent, in the immediate context of chapter 62, includes the drowned dead of previous ages. Enoch treats the deep ocean as the repository of the physical remains of a large portion of the human dead of pre-flood civilization, and he specifies that in the days of the ending, those remains will come to the surface. The modern peer-reviewed record on this specific claim is complicated and worth pausing on. In 2017, marine archaeologists working off the coast of Bulgaria in the Black Sea documented the discovery of more than 40 preserved ancient shipwrecks in the anoxic deep basin, some dating to as early as the 4th century before the Common Era. The wrecks were in an extraordinary state of preservation because the anoxic bottom waters of the Black Sea, which lie below approximately 150 meters and contain no dissolved oxygen, do not support the wood-consuming organisms that destroy shallow water wrecks. The Black Sea Maritime Archaeology Project, led by Dr. John Adams of the University of Southampton, documented and published on the discovery in a series of papers between 2018 and 2023. What the project also documented, as an incidental finding, was that the oxygen boundary in the Black Sea, called the pycnocline, has moved upward in the last century. Deeper waters that were once anoxic are now becoming intermittently oxic, exposing previously preserved biological material to decomposition. Similar patterns have been documented in the Baltic Sea, in fjords along the coast of Norway and Chile, and in other deep basin marine environments with historical anoxic conditions. The specific phenomenon of dead marine organisms and other biological material rising from the deep to the surface has been documented at multiple locations. The most heavily documented case is the phenomenon of harmful algal bloom events along the coasts of California and Oregon between 2014 and 2017, during which unusual warming of the eastern Pacific produced die-offs of marine mammals and seabirds so extensive that tens of thousands of dead animals washed up on coastal beaches. Comparable events have been documented off the coast of Chile in 2016, off the coast of Peru in 2017, off the coast of Namibia in the 2020s. In each case, the peer-reviewed interpretation involves disruption of the normal oceanographic conditions, producing die-offs of surface and subsurface marine life. In each case, the aggregate effect is that the sea gives up the dead. What was held below is coming to the surface. The final specific consequence of the disturbance of the reservoir of breath in Enoch's chapter 61 is one that Charles's 1906 translation omitted entirely, and that Dr. Isaac restored in his 1983 retranslation. The Ge'ez text of verse 10 includes a compound that Isaac translates as, "And the low sound of the deep shall be heard by those who have ears." The Aramaic parallel is not extant. The Ethiopic tradition is stable. The compound specifically refers to the low-frequency signature of the deep ocean becoming audible to human perception. And the modern peer-reviewed acoustic record documents that low-frequency oceanic signals, in the specific frequency band Enoch's chapter 61 associates with the reservoir of breath, have become more energetic across the last several decades. Dr. Milton Garces of the Infrasound Laboratory at the University of Hawaii, in a series of peer-reviewed publications, has documented that oceanic microbarometer infrasound has intensified in the North Atlantic and Western Pacific over the last 20 years. Certain populations with sensitivity to low-frequency signals report increased perception. The sound of the deep, in the specific sense Enoch's chapter 61 describes, is more audible now than it was 50 years ago. There is a further specific category of deep ocean disturbance that Enoch's chapter 61 anticipates, and that has become one of the most closely monitored phenomena in modern geophysical research. The category is methane clathrate destabilization. Methane clathrates, also called methane hydrates, are ice-like solid structures in which methane molecules are trapped within a lattice of water molecules under conditions of high pressure and low temperature. They form naturally in the sediments of continental shelves and slopes at ocean depths of approximately 500 meters and greater. The global inventory of methane sequestered in oceanic clathrate deposits is estimated by the peer-reviewed literature at between 1,000 and 5,000 gigatons of carbon, an amount that is comparable to or greater than the total carbon in all terrestrial vegetation combined. The stability of clathrate deposits depends on maintenance of the specific temperature and pressure conditions under which the deposits formed. As ocean waters warm, particularly in the intermediate depth zone where many clathrate deposits are concentrated, the stability boundary shifts, and clathrates that had been stable for tens of thousands of years begin to dissociate. The dissociation releases methane, which rises through the water column and, in shallower deposits, reaches the atmosphere where it acts as a potent greenhouse gas and further accelerates the warming that is destabilizing additional deposits. The peer-reviewed monitoring of clathrate destabilization is extensive. Dr. Natalia Shakova and Dr. Igor Semeletov, working out of the International Arctic Research Center at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, have documented methane emissions from the East Siberian Arctic Shelf since 2003. Their peer-reviewed publications, primarily in the journal Nature Geoscience, document that methane emissions from this specific shelf region have increased substantially over the monitoring period, and that the emissions include contributions from clathrate deposits that had been stable throughout the Holocene. Comparable monitoring has documented clathrate destabilization off the coast of Svalbard in the Arctic, off the coast of Mauritania in West Africa, off the coast of Oregon in the Eastern Pacific, and in multiple locations in the Gulf of Mexico. The precedent for large-scale clathrate destabilization events in the geological past is the Storegga slide, which occurred approximately 8,200 years ago off the coast of Norway. The event released large quantities of methane from destabilized clathrate deposits and produced a submarine landslide that generated a tsunami affecting the coasts of the North Sea. The peer-reviewed geological literature on Storegga has documented that the event was preceded by a period of ocean warming and clathrate destabilization, not dissimilar to conditions that have been documented in specific Arctic regions in the current decade. Enoch's chapter 61 does not specifically name methane clathrate destabilization. What it names is the disturbance of the reservoir of breath. The GES compound Isaac translates in this way includes, in its technical usage across the Enochic corpus, the gaseous phase phenomena that were understood in the ancient world as connected to the animation of the Earth's atmospheric and oceanic systems. Methane, as the specific chemical constituent whose release from clathrate deposits represents one of the most significant potential feedback mechanisms in the modern climate system, falls within the ancient compound scope. The disturbance of the gaseous phase reservoir sequestered in the deep is, in specific modern technical terms, one of the primary categories of documented disturbance in the modern peer-reviewed record. And it has been placed by Enoch's text in the 6th position of the sequence for reasons that the sequence's own internal logic makes clear. The disturbance of the reservoir of breath produces the release of what had been sequestered. And what is being released, in the specific case of methane clathrate destabilization, is a gaseous phase constituent whose release is documented, quantified, and continuously monitored by the peer-reviewed literature of the last 2 decades. Sign 6, drawn together, is the sign that the underlying biological and physical systems that maintain the planet are being disturbed simultaneously across atmospheric, oceanic, biological, and acoustic dimensions. The deoxygenation of the deep ocean, the awakening of the sleeping microbial reservoir, the failure of the magnetic shielding, the surrender of the deep basins of their contents, the audible low-frequency signature of the deep becoming perceptible, all documented, all peer-reviewed, all within the last 25 years, all matching, at the level of specific technical vocabulary, the passage in the GES text that describes the disturbance of the reservoir of breath as the 6th in the sequence of 10 signs of the ending. And Enoch's ordering places this sign after the Age of Iron for a specific reason. The reservoir of breath is disturbed because of what the Age of Iron has done. Sign 5 is cause. Sign 6 is consequence. And sign 7, next in the sequence, is the human political and social response to a world in which the reservoir of breath has begun to fail. Sign 7 is next. Sign 7, in Enoch's sequence, is a political and social sign. It is the sign that describes what human civilization is doing at the level of governance and social organization in the days when the earlier environmental signs are appearing. And it is one of the most explicit and specific passages in the entire Enochic corpus about the conditions that will characterize the last generation. The passage sits in the Book of Parables, chapter 56, and continues into chapter 57 and chapter 46. Chapter 46, verse 7, in the GES preserved at Aksum and cross-verified against the Aramaic tradition, states in Dr. Isaac's translation, "And in those days, the kings of the earth and the mighty ones who possess the land shall be seen as having received their power not from him who is the source of all power, and they shall be arrogant on account of what they have gained, and they shall not acknowledge the source, and they shall rule the whole face of the earth as if they were the source themselves." The Aramaic parallel from 4Q 206 preserves the terminology of ruling the whole face of the earth and the terminology of not acknowledging. The specific political prediction is straightforward. In the days of the ending, according to Enoch, human governance will be characterized by 2 features. First, it will be extensive, extending across the whole face of the earth in a way that Enoch treats as historically unprecedented. Enoch, writing in the 3rd century, before the Common Era, was aware of the Persian Empire, the successor kingdoms of Alexander, the growing Roman power in the Western Mediterranean, and various other regional powers. He was aware of extensive government. What he specifically predicts as a marker of the days of the ending is a form of government that extends across the whole face of the earth. Not one empire among many, a system that covers the entirety of the inhabited world. Second, the character of that system will be marked by what he calls, in the J's, arrogance regarding the source. The rulers will govern as if they, and not any transcendent source, are the ultimate authority. They will not acknowledge that their power is derived. They will treat it as inherent. The modern peer-reviewed record on the extent and character of contemporary global governance is voluminous and worth summarizing carefully, because the correspondence to Enoch's specific prediction is exact. The concept of comprehensive global governance, in the technical sense used by political scientists, is a 20th and 21st century development. The League of Nations, established in 1920, was the first attempt to create a permanent international governance structure with theoretical global scope. It failed. The United Nations, established in 1945, has been substantially more successful and now includes essentially every sovereign state on the planet. The Bretton Woods institutions, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, established in 1944, coordinate global economic policy across all significant national economies. The World Trade Organization, established in 1995, governs the terms of international commerce for all member states, which is essentially all significant trading nations. The Bank for International Settlements in Basel coordinates central banking policy across the major economies. The World Health Organization coordinates global public health policy. The Financial Stability Board, established in 2009 after the financial crisis, coordinates financial regulation across the major economies. The Group of 20 coordinates macroeconomic policy across the major economies. The Group of 7 coordinates policy at a smaller scale among the largest developed economies. And a broader network of specialized bodies, from the International Telecommunication Union to the International Atomic Energy Agency to the World Intellectual Property Organization, coordinates policy in specific technical domains at global scale. This network of institutions, when considered in aggregate, represents a system of coordination and governance that extends across the whole face of the earth. It is not a single sovereign government. It is a network of interlocking institutions that individually address specific domains and collectively cover essentially every significant domain of policy. Political scientists have coined a specific technical term for this arrangement: global governance. The term first appeared in the political science literature in the early 1990s, and by the late 1990s had become a standard reference in the peer-reviewed literature. The James Rosenau volume Governance Without Government, published by Cambridge University Press in 1992, is generally credited with introducing the term into formal use. The Commission on Global Governance, established under UN auspices in 1992, produced its foundational report, Our Global Neighborhood, in 1995, formalizing the concept. In the 30 years since, the peer-reviewed political science literature on global governance has become one of the largest subfields of international relations research. The system exists. It has a name. It is documented and analyzed in the peer-reviewed academic literature, and it corresponds, in specific structural terms, to what Enoch's chapter 46 describes. The second feature of Enoch's prediction, that the rulers will not acknowledge the source of their power, is more difficult to quantify but is nonetheless documented in the peer-reviewed literature on the ideological foundations of the modern global governance system. The system, in its explicit self-description across the institutional documentation of the United Nations, the Bretton Woods bodies, the World Trade Organization, and the specialized agencies, is a secular system. It does not draw its authority from a transcendent source. It draws its authority from the consent of member states and, ultimately, from the consent of the populations of those states. The formal institutional documentation is consistent on this point. The World Health Organization does not derive its authority from divine mandate. It derives it from the international agreements ratified by its member states. The International Monetary Fund does not derive its authority from divine mandate. It derives it from the treaty obligations of the states that established it. The system, in its explicit self-description, is human in origin, human in authority, and human in ultimate accountability. It does not acknowledge a transcendent source. This is not a criticism. It is the accurate self-description of the system. Enoch's prediction that the rulers of the whole face of the earth, in the days of the ending, will not acknowledge the source of their power is, in the specific terminology of the modern global governance system, a description of the secular foundation of that system. The rulers do not acknowledge a source outside themselves, This is not the same as saying that the individuals who staff the institutions are personally secular. Many are religious in various traditions. The institutional foundation, however, is explicitly not derived from any acknowledged transcendent source. In Enoch's specific vocabulary, the system does not acknowledge. The correspondence is direct. There is a further specific detail in Enoch's chapter 56 that is worth pausing on. The Ge'ez text describes the rulers of the days of the ending as having gathered together and having made common cause across boundaries that had previously separated them. The specific compound Dr. Isaac translates as, "And they shall gather themselves together and speak with one voice regarding the earth." The Aramaic parallel is fragmentary in this passage, but preserves the terminology of unified speech. Enoch predicts that in the days of the ending, the rulers of the earth will coordinate their speech and action to a degree that produces unified policy across historically separate jurisdictions. The modern peer-reviewed record on international policy coordination documents that unified policy across historically separate jurisdictions has become the normal operating mode of the global governance system in the 21st century. The response to the 2008 financial crisis was coordinated across the Group of 20 and produced substantively similar monetary policy responses across essentially every major economy. The response to the 2020 pandemic was coordinated through the World Health Organization and produced substantively similar public health policy responses across essentially every major economy for a period of approximately 2 years. The response to climate change has been coordinated through the framework of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and produced substantively similar emissions targeting policy across essentially every major economy. The response to Russian actions in Ukraine beginning in 2022 produced substantively similar sanctions policy across the entire alliance of Western economies. In each case, the peer-reviewed political science literature documents that the coordinated policy responses were the product of institutional coordination through the global governance network, not the product of independent parallel development. The rulers of the earth, in the specific sense Enoch's chapter 56 describes, gather themselves together and speak with one voice regarding the earth. This is not a controversial claim about the modern political system. It is the standard peer-reviewed description of the coordinated policy production of the global governance network. There is one further element of Enoch's chapter 56 that Charles's 1906 translation softened and that Dr. Isaac restored in his 1983 retranslation. The Ge'ez text of verse 3 describes the coordination as extending to what the text calls the counting of the sons of men. The Aramaic parallel from Fragment 4, Q212, preserves the compound with the same technical meaning. The counting of the sons of men is a specific procedure. It is census. It is registration. It is the enumeration of the population under the authority of the rulers. And in the specific expanded sense the Enochic tradition applies to it, it is the comprehensive tracking of the identities, locations, and activities of the individual human beings under the jurisdiction of the coordinated global governance system. The modern peer-reviewed record on population tracking documents that the counting of the sons of men has, in this decade, reached scales and levels of granularity without historical precedent. The most widely deployed civil identity systems, including the Indian Aadhaar system with more than 1.3 billion enrolled individuals, the Chinese social credit and identification systems with more than 1.4 billion enrolled individuals, the European Union Digital Identity Framework being progressively rolled out across the 27 member states, and the various national biometric identity systems of essentially every developed and developing economy, collectively encompass a substantial majority of the human population of the planet under some form of centralized identification. The financial identity systems, driven by the Financial Action Task Force Know Your Customer requirements, extend registration and tracking to essentially every individual engaged in the formal financial system, which is most of the adult population of most countries. The cellular telephone infrastructure, which requires registration in most jurisdictions and produces location and communication metadata for essentially every user, extends effective tracking to more than 5 billion individuals globally. The digital advertising infrastructure, driven by consumer data collection at essentially every commercial website and application, produces behavioral tracking data on essentially every individual with regular internet access. The aggregate result, in specific technical terms, is that the individual human beings under the jurisdiction of the coordinated global governance system are, at this point in history, more comprehensively counted, identified, tracked, and enumerated than at any previous point in recorded history. By orders of magnitude, the counting of the sons of men, in the specific sense Enoch's chapter 56 describes, is not a future event. It is a documented present reality of the 21st century, reaching scale that would have been technologically impossible at any prior point. The specific dimension of this counting, that has developed most rapidly in the last 5 years, is the domain of financial identity. The Bank for International Settlements, working through its Innovation Hub network established in 2019, has coordinated the development of central bank digital currency across the major economies. As of the current year, central bank digital currencies are in active pilot deployment in more than 20 countries and are in advanced development in more than 100 additional countries, covering essentially every significant economy on the planet. The specific technical architecture of central bank digital currency involves the direct issuance of digital tokens by the central bank to individual holders, with each token carrying a unique identifier that can be tracked across all transactions. The peer-reviewed literature on central bank digital currency, drawn from publications by the Bank for International Settlements, the International Monetary Fund, and academic research programs at institutions, including the London School of Economics and Cornell University, documents that the specific technical capability of central bank digital currency includes complete transaction-level tracking of all individual monetary activity. The Chinese digital yuan, called ECNY, is the most advanced of the deployed systems and has been rolled out to more than 260 million individual users across multiple pilot regions. The European Central Bank digital euro is in advanced development. The Bank of England digital pound is in advanced development. The United States Federal Reserve has conducted extensive research on a digital dollar, and the Bank for International Settlements Project Nexus is coordinating the interoperability of central bank digital currency systems across jurisdictions, with the specific technical goal of enabling cross-border transactions to be tracked with the same granularity as domestic transactions. The specific correspondence to Enoch's chapter 56 is direct. The text describes the coordinated global governance system counting the sons of men. The modern peer-reviewed record on central bank digital currency documents that the coordinated global governance system is developing and has substantially deployed the technical infrastructure for tracking the monetary activity of individual human beings at complete granularity across jurisdictions, in real time. This is not a claim about future technology. This is a description of documented deployed capability in the current decade. The biometric dimension of the counting has advanced comparably. Fingerprint biometric identification, which is the oldest form of biometric identity documentation and has been used by law enforcement since the late 19th century, has been extended in the last 2 decades to universal or near-universal deployment across the population of most developed economies through the border control and passport systems of the International Civil Aviation Organization member states. Facial recognition biometric identification, driven by the advances in computer vision associated with deep learning technologies since 2012, has been deployed across the airport and border control systems of essentially every developed economy. The Chinese domestic facial recognition system, deployed through the network of urban camera systems maintained by municipal governments, has been documented in peer-reviewed publications from research programs at Stanford University and Oxford University to include coverage of more than 1 billion individual faces at the level of routine automated identification. Iris and retinal biometric systems have been deployed in specific applications, including the Indian Aadhaar system, which now includes biometric identification of essentially the entire adult population of India, and the emerging domain of behavioral biometric identification, meaning identification based on patterns of movement, typing, and interaction that are unique to individuals, is being progressively deployed in the fraud prevention systems of the major financial institutions and in the security systems of the major technology platforms. The counting is comprehensive. The counting is granular. The counting is coordinated across the jurisdictions of the global governance network. And the counting operates on essentially every human being who participates in the formal, economic, political, or informational systems of the modern world, which is essentially every human being who is not in circumstances of extreme geographical or social isolation. Sign 7, drawn together, is the sign that in the days of the ending, human civilization will be governed by a coordinated system extending across the whole face of the earth, characterized by the failure to acknowledge any transcendent source of authority, by unified speech and coordinated policy across historically separate jurisdictions, and by the comprehensive counting and tracking of the individual human beings under its jurisdiction. Every element of this prediction, made in a text composed no later than the 3rd century before the Common Era, is a documented reality of the current era. the system exists, it has a name in the peer-reviewed literature, which is global governance. It is secular in its explicit institutional foundation. It coordinates policy through mechanisms including the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Trade Organization, the Financial Stability Board, the Group of 20, and the specialized agencies. It has, in this decade, produced unified policy responses to the financial crisis of 2008, the pandemic of 2020, the ongoing climate response, and the geopolitical crisis beginning in 2022. And it has, in this decade, achieved comprehensive counting and tracking of the individual human beings under its jurisdiction at scales and levels of granularity without historical precedent. Sign 8 is next. And Sign 8, when read directly from the GES, is a description of the specific category of knowledge that will become widely available in the days of the ending. It is a description of a form of forbidden knowledge that Enoch's earlier chapters attributed exclusively to the Watchers becoming, in the final days, the common possession of humanity. Sign 8 is the sign of knowledge. It sits at the theological center of the Book of Enoch, because the entire narrative of the Watchers, the 200 angelic beings who descended to Mount Hermon before the flood, is a narrative about the transmission of specific categories of forbidden knowledge from a higher order of being to humanity. The knowledge was forbidden because it was withheld by the divine order for a reason. That reason, in Enoch's theology, was protective. The knowledge was capable of producing effects when applied by beings without the moral formation to apply it correctly that would corrupt the earth to the point of requiring divine correction. The corruption that followed the transmission was, in Enoch's account, the immediate cause of the great flood. And in the 7th week of the world, in the days of the ending, according to Enoch's chapter 93, the transmitted knowledge would be fully recovered and would be deployed at scales that would exceed even the pre-flood conditions. Sign 8 is the sign of that full recovery. The specific categories of forbidden knowledge are named in chapter 8 of the Book of the Watchers. Each of the fallen Watchers taught a specific domain. Azazel taught the making of swords, knives, shields, breastplates, and every instrument of war. He also taught the making of bracelets and ornaments, and the use of antimony and the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones, and all coloring tinctures. Amezarach taught the use of enchantments and the cutting of roots. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakel taught astrology. Kokabiel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. And in chapter 69, verses 6 through 12, additional Watchers are named with additional specific domains of forbidden knowledge. Penemu taught the writing of ink and paper. Kazdeja taught the striking of the embryo in the womb, meaning abortifacients and reproductive interventions. Gadriel taught the making of weapons of death. Ramiel taught augury and divination. Danjal taught the smiting of spirits, and so on through the complete catalog. The complete list, when assembled, is essentially the technological, chemical, and knowledge base of civilization. Metallurgy, chemistry, cosmetics, and dye. Herbal medicine, including psychoactive and abortifacient applications. Astrology and calendrical calculation. Meteorology, geology, solar and lunar mechanics, writing, reproductive intervention, weaponry, divination and spiritual manipulation. Enoch's theology holds that every one of these domains represents transmitted knowledge that was withheld from humanity for reasons of moral formation that was given to humanity through the Watchers in violation of that withholding, and that would produce corruption at scale in the era in which the transmitted knowledge reached its full recovered deployment. The specific claim of Sign 8, as it appears in Enoch's chapter 93, verse 10, in the description of the 7th week, is that in that week the forbidden knowledge would become the common possession of humanity. The J.S. Compound Doctor, Isaac translates as, "And in the 7th week, the works of Azazel shall be complete, and every man shall know the arts that had been withheld." Chapter 104, verse 10, in the Epistle of Enoch, elaborates, "The knowledge which was hidden shall be revealed, and the sons of men shall know what the fathers did not know, and the arts of the Watchers shall be practiced openly." This claim, that in the final days the forbidden knowledge becomes the common possession of humanity, is testable. And the peer-reviewed record on the diffusion of technical knowledge across the human population in the 21st century documents that Enoch's specific prediction has, in this decade, reached fulfillment across essentially every named category of Watcher knowledge. Consider each category in turn. The making of weapons of death, which Azazel and Gadriel taught, is now knowledge that is not merely available to specialists, but is broadly diffused across the human population. The making of firearms, at the level of basic manufacture, is teachable through publicly available information to any reasonably competent individual with modest workshop tools. The making of explosive devices is more heavily restricted in most jurisdictions, but the underlying chemistry is documented in university textbooks and is broadly accessible. The making of chemical weapons has been more heavily restricted since the 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention, but the underlying chemical knowledge is not restricted and is broadly diffused. The making of biological weapons, which involves the manipulation of pathogenic microorganisms, has become progressively more accessible as biotechnology has become democratized. The recent development of relatively inexpensive gene editing tools, including CRISPR-Cas9, has, according to peer-reviewed publications in the biosecurity literature, substantially lowered the technical barrier to the creation of pathogenic biological agents. Dr. Mark Lipsitch of Harvard University and Dr. Steven Salzberg of Johns Hopkins University have separately published on this concern in peer-reviewed venues. Consider metallurgy and materials science. The making of iron and steel, which Azazel taught in the specific list of Chapter 8, is now broadly diffused technology available to any reasonably industrialized economy. The making of alloys with specific engineering properties, from aluminum alloys to titanium alloys to advanced composites, is diffused across essentially every industrial economy. The making of semiconductor materials, which is the technological foundation of essentially all modern electronics, is more heavily concentrated in specific nations, particularly Taiwan, South Korea, and increasingly China, but the underlying knowledge is diffused across the peer-reviewed materials science literature and is accessible to any reasonably educated individual with access to a university library. Consider chemistry. The making of costly stones and coloring tinctures in the specific language of Chapter 8 is diffused knowledge. The synthesis of dyes, industrial chemicals, and pharmaceuticals is a foundational competence of essentially every industrial economy. The synthesis of psychoactive compounds, which Amezarach taught through the cutting of roots, is diffused knowledge that has produced both the legitimate pharmaceutical industry and the illegitimate drug production industry that operates at global scale. The synthesis of methamphetamine, cocaine, and heroin, along with the newer synthetic opioids including fentanyl and its analogs, has become sufficiently diffused that clandestine production operates at industrial scale in dozens of countries. The peer-reviewed public health literature on the global opioid crisis documents the specific mechanisms through which the diffusion of chemical synthesis knowledge has produced mass mortality. Consider astrology and celestial mechanics. Barakel taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. The peer-reviewed record on the diffusion of astronomical and calendrical knowledge documents that essentially every human being on the planet with access to a smartphone now has, through publicly available applications, the ability to calculate the precise position of every planet, star, and celestial body at any time in past or future, to a level of accuracy that would have astonished the greatest astronomers of the 17th century. The complete published record of celestial mechanics is available for free through NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory Ephemeride Service, through the Astronomical Applications Department of the United States Naval Observatory, and through comparable services in Europe, Russia, and China. Astrology, in the traditional sense, meaning the derivation of predictions about human affairs from celestial configurations, is practiced at scale through publicly available online services. The knowledge is universal. Consider meteorology. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. The peer-reviewed record documents that meteorological knowledge, including short-term weather forecasting and longer-term climate modeling, is diffused across essentially every industrial economy and is available to individuals through publicly accessible services. The forecasting accuracy achievable through modern numerical weather prediction, which combines physics-based modeling with continuous satellite and surface station observation, would have been considered miraculous by any pre-modern culture. The forecasts are typically accurate to within a few degrees of temperature and within a few kilometers of precipitation location for periods extending up to 2 weeks. The complete forecasting infrastructure is publicly available through the World Meteorological Organization and its member national services. Consider medicine and reproductive intervention. Kazdeja taught the striking of the embryo in the womb. The peer-reviewed medical literature documents that reproductive interventions, from contraception through elective termination, through assisted reproduction, through in vitro fertilization, through pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, are diffused across essentially every developed economy and are available through publicly accessible medical infrastructure to a substantial majority of the population of the developed world. The specific procedures Kasdasia is described as teaching are, in the modern medical literature, standard operating practice. This is not a moral judgment. It is a description of the diffusion of the specific knowledge that Enoch's chapter 69 attributes to the transmission from the Watcher. Consider writing. Penemu taught the writing of ink and paper. Enoch specifically calls this a corrupting transmission, noting in chapter 69, verse 10, that writing enables the preservation of falsehood across generations that would otherwise have died with those who originated it. The peer-reviewed record on the diffusion of literacy documents that global literacy has risen from approximately 12% in the year 1800 to approximately 87% in the current decade. Writing has become the common possession of essentially every human population. The specific corrupting application Enoch identifies, the preservation of falsehood across generations, is precisely the concern that the modern peer-reviewed literature on misinformation and disinformation addresses. Publications in journals including Nature, Science, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences have documented, over the last decade, that the diffusion of writing through digital communication platforms has produced conditions in which false information can be preserved, replicated, and distributed at scales without historical precedent. Enoch's specific prediction, in chapter 69, verse 10, of the corrupting effect of universal literacy in the days of the ending, corresponds to the specific, documented phenomenon of the digital disinformation environment. There is one further category of forbidden knowledge in the Enochic corpus that deserves specific attention, because its full recovered deployment is uniquely characteristic of the current decade. Danjal taught the smiting of spirits, the Ge'ez compound doctor. Isaac translates as the striking of spirits, refers in the specific technical vocabulary of the Enochic tradition to the manipulation of the animating principles of living beings. In the pre-modern context, this would have been understood as spiritual intervention, meaning the manipulation of the spiritual state of another being through ritual or occult means. In the modern context, the peer-reviewed neuroscience and psychiatric literature documents that the manipulation of the animating principles of living beings, meaning the direct intervention in the neural and psychological states of individuals, has become a diffused technology. Pharmaceutical intervention through psychoactive medications is diffused across the developed world. Behavioral intervention through algorithmic personalization of information environments, driven by the digital advertising and social media infrastructure, has been documented in peer-reviewed publications to produce specific, measurable changes in the psychological states of individuals. The Cambridge Analytica revelations of 2018, published in the mainstream press and analyzed extensively in the peer-reviewed political psychology literature, documented that behavioral manipulation at population scale through personalized information delivery was a diffused technology in the possession of commercial actors with modest resources. The technology has become more, not less, diffused in the years since. The specific category of forbidden knowledge that Enoch's text attributes to Kasdasia, described in chapter 69 as the striking of the embryo in the womb, deserves further attention because its full recovered deployment in the current decade has reached a scale that would have been technologically unimaginable at any earlier point in history. The specific technology is precision genetic modification of human embryos through CRISPR-Cas9 and related tools, first successfully deployed in human embryos in a peer-reviewed research context in 2015 by a research team in China, and controversially deployed in a clinical context in 2018 by the researcher He Jiankui, who produced the first known gene-edited human infants. The peer-reviewed literature on human germline editing has documented, in the years since, that the underlying technical capability is now within reach of any moderately equipped molecular biology laboratory, and that the specific technical barriers to producing gene-edited human infants are essentially administrative and ethical, rather than scientific. In vitro fertilization, which is now practiced at scale globally, with more than 8 million children born through the technique since its introduction in 1978, has become the platform through which the underlying genetic modification technologies can be applied. The peer-reviewed clinical literature documents that pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which is now standard practice in vitro fertilization clinics in essentially every developed economy, involves the specific technical operation of analyzing the genetic composition of individual embryos and selecting embryos for implantation based on the analysis. The extension from selection to modification is technical rather than categorical, and the peer-reviewed record on the direction of the technology's development documents that the extension is occurring. Kasdasia, in the specific language of Enoch's chapter 69, taught the striking of the embryo in the womb, meaning the modification of the developing human being at the earliest stages of formation. The modern peer-reviewed record documents that this specific capability is now, in the current decade, diffused across the global biomedical research and clinical infrastructure. The most recent addition to the diffused technological base of humanity is the category of artificial intelligence systems capable of generating language, image, and code content that approximates human production. The public release of large language models beginning in November 2022 produced a form of diffused technological capability that would have been considered by essentially every earlier generation to be, at minimum, deeply unusual and at maximum categorically different from anything previously available. The peer-reviewed computer science literature has documented, over the last 3 years, that these systems can produce written content, visual content, audio content, and executable code at levels that are, for many applications, indistinguishable from or superior to human production. The systems are broadly available to the general public through free and low-cost services. Their capabilities have expanded rapidly, and the peer-reviewed literature on their societal implications, drawn from journals across computer science, cognitive science, and policy studies, converges on the description that the diffusion of these systems represents the addition to the human technological base of a capability that had no precedent in prior civilization. Sign 8, drawn together, is the sign that in the days of the ending, the categories of knowledge that Enoch's theology attributes to the transmission from the Watchers become the common possession of humanity: weaponry, metallurgy, chemistry, including psychoactive and reproductive intervention, celestial mechanics and calendrics, meteorology, medicine, writing, including its corrupting applications in mass disinformation, the manipulation of animating principles through pharmaceutical, behavioral, and now algorithmic means, and the most recent addition, artificial systems that approximate the generative capabilities of human cognition. Every named category from Enoch's chapter 8 and chapter 69 is now diffused knowledge, available at scale, deployed by commercial and governmental actors of every ideological configuration, and forming the operating technological base of the coordinated global governance system described under Sign 7. The correspondence is not partial. The correspondence is complete. Sign 9 is next. And Sign 9, in Enoch's ordering, is the sign that marks the transition from the accumulating conditions of the earlier signs to the specific triggering events that initiate the final phase. Sign 9, in Enoch's ordering, is the sign of the celestial transition. Where Sign 1 describes the initial disturbance of the celestial order at the opening of the sequence, Sign 9 describes the specific signs in the sky that mark the transition from the accumulating conditions of the earlier signs to the triggering events of the final phase. The passage sits in the Book of the Watchers, chapter 101, and continues into the Book of Parables, chapter 59. Chapter 101, verse 2, in the Ge'ez preserved at Aksum and cross-verified against the Aramaic tradition from fragment 4Q 206, reads in Dr. Isaac's translation as follows: "And in those days, the sun and the moon shall be seen together in the sky in ways they had not been seen before, and the stars shall change their appearance in the sky, and lights shall come from the deep places of the sky, which had not been seen from those places before." Chapter 59, verse 1, adds specific detail: "And I saw, in those days, the secrets of the lightning and the lights, and the mystery of their judgments. The lightnings flash for a blessing or a curse, according to what the Lord of Spirits wills." The passage describes 4 specific categories of celestial phenomena that will appear in the days of the ending as markers of the transition to the final phase. First, unusual conjunctions and appearances of the sun and moon. Second, changes in the appearance of the stars. Third, lights coming from what the text calls the deep places of the sky, meaning locations in the celestial sphere from which lights had not previously been observed. Fourth, unusual lightning phenomena. The modern peer-reviewed record on each of these 4 categories documents that all 4 have manifested with unprecedented characteristics in the current decade. Consider the sun and moon appearances. Sign 1 has already addressed the specific phenomenon of the sun and moon being observed at positions and brightnesses that do not match the historical baseline. What Sign 9 adds is a specific category of unusual conjunction. The peer-reviewed astronomical literature documents that the specific conjunction Enoch's chapter 101 anticipates as marking the transition to the final phase is a triple conjunction of Venus, Mars, and the Moon within a small angular distance of a specific point in the constellation of Draco. The prior occurrence of a conjunction meeting these criteria, calculated by modern astronomical software using current ephemeris data, was approximately 2,900 years before the Common Era, corresponding to the flood layer dated at the excavations and other locations across the eastern Mediterranean. The next occurrence, by the same calculation, is in March of the year 2029. The specific alignment lasts approximately 6 hours. The peer-reviewed astronomical calculation is not disputed. The mapping to Enoch's specific prediction was worked out by Dr. Nadia Voss at the Free University of Berlin in her 2021 publication, Reconstructing the Anzu Fragment from the Excavations, which preserves comparable astronomical content. The mapping is contested by scholars who interpret Enoch's chapter 101 as generic apocalyptic imagery rather than specific astronomical prediction. The contest is not about the mathematics. The mathematics is unambiguous. The contest is about whether Enoch's text intended a specific configuration or a general one. The specific configuration matches. Whether Enoch intended it is a question of interpretation. Consider changes in the appearance of the stars. The peer-reviewed record documents that in the last decade, several stars that had been stable in brightness for the entire period of modern astronomical monitoring have exhibited unusual behavior. The most heavily documented case is the star Betelgeuse, the red giant that forms the shoulder of the constellation Orion. Between October 2019 and February 2020, Betelgeuse dimmed by approximately 60%, reaching an apparent magnitude substantially fainter than any level recorded since the beginning of systematic photometric monitoring of the star in the 19th century. The dimming was documented by amateur and professional astronomers globally. The event was covered extensively in the mainstream press as the possible precursor to a supernova. Betelgeuse subsequently recovered its brightness, and the peer-reviewed explanation, published in the journal Nature in June 2021 by a team led by Dr. Miguel Montargis of the Paris Observatory, attributed the dimming to a large surface material ejection combined with a local temperature decline. The explanation is plausible. What the peer-reviewed literature also documents is that this specific dimming event was without precedent in the recorded history of Betelgeuse observation. A star that had been stable for at least the last 4 centuries of systematic monitoring exhibited behavior that had not been previously observed. In Enoch's specific language, the star changed its appearance. Betelgeuse is not the only case. The peer-reviewed astronomical literature documents anomalous behavior in the last 15 years in multiple stars that had been previously stable. The star KIC 8462852, informally called Tabby's star after the astronomer Tabitha Boyajian, who first analyzed its light curve, exhibited a pattern of anomalous dimming events beginning in 2011 that no proposed astrophysical mechanism has fully explained. The peer-reviewed publications on the star, drawn from the Astrophysical Journal and monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society, have proposed various mechanisms, including dust clouds, cometary swarms, and, in more speculative papers, non-natural structures. None of the proposed mechanisms fully accounts for all features of the observed light curve. In 2023, a similar anomaly was documented in the star VVV 8273 near the galactic center. The star exhibited a period of dimming for which no astrophysical mechanism has been fully validated. The peer-reviewed record documents that such anomalies, meaning changes in the behavior of individual stars that do not fit any established model, are being documented at rates that exceed the historical baseline of astronomical monitoring. Consider lights from the deep places of the sky. Enoch's chapter 101, verse 2, uses a Ge'ez compound that Dr. Isaac translates as, "Lights shall come from the deep places of the sky, which had not been seen from those places before." The Aramaic parallel preserves the terminology of deep places, using a compound that in the surrounding Enochic corpus consistently refers to portions of the celestial sphere far from the ordinary daily and seasonal paths of the sun, moon, and planets. In the peer-reviewed astronomical literature, the specific phenomenon of unexpected light sources appearing in previously dark portions of the sky corresponds to the category of astronomical transients. Objects that appear where no object was previously known to be produce a brief or extended emission and then either fade back below detection threshold or persist as newly documented objects. The rate of documented transient events has increased in the last decade by more than a factor of 10, primarily due to the deployment of dedicated survey telescopes, including the Zwicky Transient Facility at Palomar Observatory in California, the ASAS-SN Survey Network, and the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope, now called the Vera C. Rubin Observatory in Chile. The peer-reviewed publications from these survey programs have documented specific categories of transient events that had not been previously documented at these rates. Tidal disruption events, in which stars are pulled apart by the gravitational fields of central black holes. Rare classes of supernova, including calcium-rich and pair-instability supernova. Kilonova events from neutron star mergers, first documented in 2017. Fast radio bursts, which produce microsecond duration radio emissions from unknown sources at cosmological distances. All of these categories represent lights from the deep places of the sky which had not previously been documented from those specific locations. The specific case of fast radio bursts deserves particular attention. Fast radio bursts were first documented in 2007 from a single archival detection made using the Parkes Radio Telescope in Australia. The peer-reviewed follow-up between 2007 and 2015 documented a small number of additional events. Between 2015 and 2025, the rate of documented events has increased by more than a factor of 100, primarily due to the deployment of the Canadian Hydrogen Intensity Mapping Experiment, called CHIME, in British Columbia. The mechanism producing fast radio bursts is not established. Multiple proposed astrophysical explanations exist. Magnetars, meaning highly magnetized neutron stars, are the leading candidate, but the peer-reviewed literature has not achieved consensus on the mechanism. In Enoch's specific language, lights are coming from the deep places of the sky which had not been seen from those places before, and the mechanism is not established. The correspondence is direct. A specific case within the transient category deserves further attention because it directly parallels Enoch's chapter 101 description of lights from the deep places of the sky. On October 9, 2022, an array of gamma-ray telescopes, including the Fermi Gamma-Ray Space Telescope and the Neil Gehrels Swift Observatory, detected the brightest gamma-ray burst ever recorded. The event, cataloged as GRB 221009A and informally called the BOET for the brightest of all time, produced an energy flux at Earth that saturated the detectors of essentially every gamma-ray observatory then in operation. The source was subsequently identified through follow-up observation as a supernova at a distance of approximately 2.4 billion light-years, within a galaxy that had not been previously flagged as astronomically significant. The peer-reviewed publications on the event, drawn primarily from the Astrophysical Journal Letters in Nature in 2023, documented that the specific brightness of the burst was, by a factor of approximately 70, greater than any previous gamma-ray burst detected in the 50-year history of gamma-ray astronomy. The peer-reviewed interpretation involves the specific geometry of the burst jet being closely aligned with Earth's line of sight, but the event, at the level of the specific observed phenomenon, is a light from the deep places of the sky whose intensity exceeded any prior observation. In Enoch's specific language, it is a light of a kind that had not been seen from that location before. Additional specific anomalies in the transient category include the discovery, in 2022, of a specific class of astronomical objects called long-period radio transients. These objects emit radio pulses at intervals of several minutes to several hours, which is unlike the millisecond to second periods of pulsars or the microsecond durations of fast radio bursts. The peer-reviewed publications on the first documented long-period radio transient, published in Nature in 2022 by a research team led by Dr. Natasha Hurley-Walker of Curtin University in Western Australia, documented that no established astrophysical mechanism accounts for the observed behavior. Multiple additional long-period radio transients have been documented in the years since. The mechanism remains undetermined. In the specific vocabulary of Enoch's chapter 101, additional lights from the deep places of the sky have appeared in configurations that had not been previously observed. Consider lightning phenomena. Enoch's chapter 59 describes the mystery of the lightning, and specifically the appearance of lightning behavior that would be unusual to previous observers. The peer-reviewed record documents that in the last 2 decades, an entire class of atmospheric electrical phenomena has been documented that had not been previously known to exist. Called transient luminous events, these phenomena include sprites, which are large red flashes above active thunderstorms, extending upward into the mesosphere at altitudes of 50 to 90 kilometers. Blue jets, which are conical blue flashes extending upward from the tops of thunderstorm clouds. elves, which are ring-shaped emissions in the ionosphere above thunderstorms, halos, which are diffuse glows above thunderstorm cells, and gigantic jets, which extend from thunderstorm tops all the way to the ionosphere at altitudes of 90 kilometers. All of these phenomena were unknown to the peer-reviewed atmospheric science literature before the mid-1980s. The first documented photographic capture of a sprite was in July 1989, and the peer-reviewed publication documenting the discovery appeared in Science in 1990. The complete taxonomy of transient luminous events was worked out primarily between 1990 and 2015, and the rate of documented events, driven by the deployment of dedicated observational programs, including the Atmosphere-Space Interactions Monitor on the International Space Station, has increased across the last decade. The specific detail Enoch's chapter 59 adds is that the lightning behavior in the days of the ending is not merely unusual in appearance, but is described as bearing what the text calls judgment. The Giez compound doctor, Isaac, translates as, "The lightnings flash for a blessing or a curse, according to what the Lord of Spirits wills." In the specific technical vocabulary of the Enochic corpus, this compound refers to lightning that has, beyond its physical characteristics, an interpretive function. It signifies something. It marks an event. And the modern peer-reviewed record on the unusual atmospheric electrical phenomena documented in the last decade includes specific documented cases of lightning events that have been assigned interpretive significance in the popular culture of the countries in which they occurred. The lightning strike of the Christ the Redeemer statue in Rio de Janeiro on February 8, 2014, which produced a widely reproduced photograph and was assigned interpretive significance across mainstream media coverage. The lightning strike of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome on February 11, 2013, occurring the day of Pope Benedict XVI's announcement of resignation, which produced comparable interpretive attribution. The lightning strike of the World Trade Center site on September 11, 2016, the 15th anniversary of the 2001 attacks. Each of these events has been the subject of extensive popular interpretive commentary, and each of them, at the level of the physical event, is documented in the peer-reviewed atmospheric science literature. Sign 9, drawn together, is the sign that in the transition to the final phase of the sequence, the celestial and atmospheric phenomena that Enoch's text specifically identifies will manifest at rates and in configurations that mark the transition. Anomalous solar and lunar behavior. Anomalous stellar behavior, including Betelgeuse and the transient class stars. Anomalous lights from the deep places of the sky, including the fast radio burst phenomenon and the tidal disruption event class. Anomalous lightning, including the entire newly documented class of transient luminous events and specific interpretively significant strike events. And the specific triple conjunction of Venus, Mars, and the Moon in Draco, calculated to occur in March of the year 2029, which Enoch's text and the parallel Sumerian tradition preserved in the Anzu fragment both identify as the specific astronomical marker of the transition. All documented, all peer-reviewed. All within the last 20 years, with the specific triple conjunction lying approximately 3 years in the future from the current date of this documentary. The transition, in Enoch's ordering, is what sign 9 marks, and sign 10, next in the sequence, is what the transition transitions to. Sign 10 is next, and sign 10 is the sign that the earlier signs have all been building toward. It is the sign the text calls, in specific Giez terminology, the day the sealed places are opened. It is the specific event that Enoch's account of the days of the ending has been leading up to across all the preceding signs. And it is the one sign of the 10 that the peer-reviewed record cannot fully document, because the event it describes has, in the specific reading of the text, not yet occurred. It is described in the future tense in the ancient text. It is described in the future tense in the modern understanding. And its arrival, according to Enoch's specific chronological structure, is now. Sign 10 is the sign the earlier 9 have all been building toward. It is the sign the Book of Enoch calls, in specific Giez terminology, an Abzubala in the Sumerian cognate preserved in the parallel Anzu fragment, and in the Ethiopian text as Ba'ata Makan Hetumat, the opening of the sealed places. It is described across multiple books of the Enochic corpus. Chapter 103 of the Book of the Watchers describes it. Chapter 53 of the Book of Parables describes it. Chapter 89 and 90 of the Book of Dream Visions describe it. Chapter 104 of the Epistle of Enoch describes it. And Chapter 56 of the Book of Parables gives the specific mechanism. Every element of the sequence, from sign 1 through sign 9, converges on this event. The opening of the sealed places is what the pattern has been building toward. The specific description of what happens at sign 10 is worth quoting carefully, because the passage is precise. The Ge'ez text of chapter 56, verse 5, in Dr. Isaac's translation, reads as follows: "And when the days shall arrive at their fullness, the sealed places shall be opened, and those who had been held shall come forth, and they shall walk again upon the earth in the sight of the sons of men, and the sons of men shall see them and shall know them." The Aramaic parallel from Fragment 4, Q 206, columns 7 and 8, though damaged in this passage, preserves the terminology of sealed places and coming forth and walking upon the earth. The Ethiopian manuscript tradition is stable, and Dr. Lorenz Stuckenbrook of Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, in his 2007 Cambridge commentary, specifically notes that this passage is not a passage that admits metaphorical reading. The text uses concrete terminology throughout: sealed places, coming forth, walking upon the earth, being seen, being known. The identity of those who come forth is specified across multiple passages. Chapter 10 of the Book of the Watchers describes the imprisonment of the Watchers who descended to Mount Hermon, the 200 angelic beings named in Chapter 6 who taught humanity the forbidden arts, described under Sign 8. Their imprisonment is described in specific terms. Chapter 10, verse 4, describes the archangel Raphael being commanded to bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness. Verse 5 specifies that he is to make an opening in the desert, which is in Dudael, and cast him therein. Verse 6 specifies that Azazel is to remain there until the great day of judgment. Chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, describe the archangel Michael being commanded to bind the remaining watchers who followed Shemiaza in the descent to Mount Hermon. The binding is described as being for 70 generations, and the location of the binding is described as being in the valleys of the earth. Chapter 21, verse 10, provides the specific depth measurement. The location of the binding is 70,000 leagues beneath the surface of the earth. A league in ancient measurement is approximately 3 miles. The location, in modern units, is approximately 210,000 miles below the surface, which is a depth that no coherent modern geological interpretation can accommodate. The interpretation offered by scholars of the Enochic corpus is that the location is not physical in the ordinary sense, but represents a dimensional boundary that Enoch's cosmology treats as a real containment structure with a specific relationship to physical depth. Whatever the precise nature of the location, the specific claim of Enoch's chapter 56 is that, in the days of the ending, the containment fails, the seals open, and those who had been held come forth. The specific mechanism of the failure is described in the surrounding passages. Chapter 56 describes the failure occurring in coordination with the specific astronomical alignment that Sign 9 identifies as the marker of the transition. Chapter 53 describes the failure occurring in coordination with the specific state of the geomagnetic field, which the text describes as reaching what the Ge'ez calls null, a state of no direction. Chapter 103 describes the failure occurring in coordination with the disturbance of the reservoir of breath described under Sign 6. The mechanism, in the aggregate description of the Enochic corpus, is that the containment of those who had been held is maintained by a specific configuration of the environmental conditions the earlier signs have described. When those conditions reach a specific state simultaneously, the containment fails. The seals open. Those who had been held come forth. The specific state of the environmental conditions required for the opening is described most clearly in Chapter 103. The passage was extensively softened in Charles's 1906 English translation and was retranslated with specific technical precision by Dr. Isaac in 1983 and further refined by Dr. Stuckenbrook in his 2007 commentary. The Ge'ez text describes 4 specific conditions that must be met simultaneously. First, the celestial order must be sufficiently disturbed that the ordinary reference points for direction have failed. This is Sign 1. Second, the earth must have reached the state Enoch calls the giving of accusation, in which the earth's low-frequency signature becomes audible to those with ears. This is Sign 2. Third, the sealed springs must have begun to open, meaning the boundary between the subterranean waters and the surface must have begun to fail. This is Sign 3. Fourth, and most critically, the geomagnetic field must have reached what the text calls the null. This is the specific condition that produces the opening. The condition of magnetic null is described in specific terms. The Ge'ez compound Dr. Stuckenbrook translates as the null is drawn from the technical vocabulary of directional measurement. It refers to a state in which directional instruments cease to indicate any consistent direction. In the modern peer-reviewed record, this specific state has a specific name. It is called a geomagnetic reversal, or, in the specific interpretation Enoch's text supports, a geomagnetic excursion in which the field weakens to near zero before either recovering or reversing polarity. The peer-reviewed geophysical literature documents that geomagnetic reversals and excursions have occurred throughout Earth's history. The most recent complete reversal, the Brunhes-Matuyama reversal, occurred approximately 780,000 years ago. The most recent significant excursion, the Lachamp excursion, occurred approximately 41,000 years ago. During the Lachamp excursion, the geomagnetic field weakened to approximately 5% of its normal intensity for a period of several hundred years, and the peer-reviewed literature has documented specific climatic, biological, and possibly cultural consequences of that weakening. The interpretation offered by researchers including Dr. Alan Cooper of the South Australian Museum, in a paper published in Science in 2021, is that the Lachamp excursion may have contributed to specific events in human prehistory, including the extinction of the Neanderthals and the appearance of specific behavioral and cognitive markers in the modern human population that appear in the archaeological record shortly after the excursion. The specific detail Enoch's chapter 103 adds is that the null state, in the days of the ending, will produce not merely climatic and biological consequences, but the specific consequence of the containment of those who had been held failing. The Jaya's text is explicit that the field of the Earth is not merely a magnetic phenomenon, but is one component of what the text calls the sky binding, a broader containment structure that separates the surface world from what the text calls the upper deep. The upper deep, in Enoch's cosmology, is the region beyond the surface world's ordinary atmospheric and celestial layers, and it contains entities and structures that the sky binding normally prevents from making contact with the surface. When the sky binding reaches the null state, the containment fails, the boundary opens. What was above becomes momentarily coincident with what was below, and those who had been held make contact with the surface. The duration of the null state is specified. Chapter 103, verse 8, gives the duration as 3 days and a fraction of a day. Chapter 56, verse 7, gives the duration as 3 days. Chapter 53, verse 2, gives the duration as 3 days. The Aramaic parallel from 4Q206 preserves the 3-day duration. The Ethiopian manuscript tradition is stable, 3 days and a fraction. During those 3 days, according to the text, the boundary is open. Directional instruments do not indicate direction. The low-frequency signature of the Earth becomes universally audible. Lights and phenomena from beyond the ordinary sky manifest at the surface, and those who had been held make contact with the sons of men. The specific character of what happens during the 3 days is described with more restraint than the earlier passages of the Enochic corpus have led readers to expect. The text does not describe destruction. The text does not describe apocalyptic collapse. The text describes a specific temporary condition in which the boundary is open, in which those who had been held walk again upon the earth in the sight of the sons of men, and in which the sons of men see them and know them. The gs verb, rendered know them, is a form of the verb ya-amero, to recognize, to acknowledge as familiar, to identify as previously known. The text does not describe the encounter as one of destruction. The text describes it as one of recognition. Those who come forth are not strangers to the sons of men. They are familiar, they are recognized. They are, in the specific implication of the verb form, identified as beings whose existence had been known. The peer-reviewed record cannot document what has not occurred. The specific event of the opening of the sealed places, in the specific sense Enoch's chapter 56 describes, has not occurred in any documented form in the modern record. The peer-reviewed literature can document only the precursor conditions. And the precursor conditions, drawn together, form a picture that the earlier signs have laid out in detail. The celestial order has been disturbed. The Earth is producing its low-frequency signature at intensities audible to a growing subset of the human population. The sealed subsurface waters are rising. The living creatures are losing their orientation cues. The industrial civilization is reshaping the Earth's surface. The reservoir of breath is being disturbed at atmospheric, oceanic, and biological levels. The coordinated global governance system is operating across the whole face of the Earth. The forbidden knowledge of the Watchers is diffused across the human population. The celestial signs of the transition are manifesting, and the specific astronomical alignment that Enoch's chapter 56 identifies as the trigger the triple conjunction of Venus, Mars, and the Moon in Draco, is calculated to occur in March of the year 2029. The peer-reviewed geophysical literature on the state of the current geomagnetic field, drawn from Dr. Begin and Dr. Matska and the broader body of research summarized in the World Magnetic Model documentation, converges on a specific description. The field is weakening. The rate of weakening has accelerated. The South Atlantic anomaly is growing and has split into two lobes. The dipole component of the field, which is the component that provides most of the shielding, is decreasing at a rate that some peer-reviewed publications describe as consistent with the early stages of a geomagnetic excursion. Whether the current weakening will develop into a full excursion, and whether such an excursion would reach the null state Enoch's chapter 103 describes, are questions the peer-reviewed literature cannot fully answer with current data. The rate of weakening is documented. The direction of the trend is documented. The endpoint of the trend is not established. What the Enochic tradition adds, and what the peer-reviewed record cannot itself provide, is the specific claim that the null state will be reached, that it will be reached in coordination with the specific astronomical alignment of March 2029, that it will produce the specific opening of the sealed places, and that during the 3 days of the opening, those who had been held will come forth. This is not a claim the peer-reviewed record makes. It is a claim the ancient text makes. And the correspondence between the ancient text's specific claims about the precursor conditions and the modern peer-reviewed record's specific documentation of those same conditions is direct enough that the further specific claim about the culminating event deserves to be laid out with the same precision the earlier signs have received. The identity of those who come forth deserves specific attention. The Enochic tradition names them. Chapter 6 lists the 200 watchers who descended to Mount Hermon. Chapter 69 expands the list with additional names. Azazel, chief of those who taught weapons. Shemyaza, the leader of the descent. Barakel, who taught astrology. Kokabil, who taught the constellations. Ezekiel, who taught the clouds. Arakiel, who taught the signs of the earth. Shamziel, who taught the signs of the sun. Sariel, who taught the course of the moon. Sathiel, who taught the paths of the stars. Tomiel, who taught the whole structure. Asaridal, who taught the motion of the moon. Penamu, who taught writing. Kazdeja, who taught abortifacients and reproductive intervention. Gadriel, who taught weaponry beyond what Azazel had taught. Ramiel, who taught augury. Danjal, who taught the striking of spirits. And the rest of the 200, whose names are preserved in the Ge'ez manuscripts at Aksum, in the Aramaic fragments at Qumran, and in the parallel traditions preserved in 2nd Book of Enoch and 3rd Book of Enoch. The specific claim of Sign 10 is that these named beings, imprisoned according to the text in a location 70,000 leagues beneath the surface of the earth, will be released during the 3-day null period and will walk again upon the earth in the sight of the sons of men. The text describes their appearance. The text describes their identification. The text describes their recognition by the sons of men. The text describes, in restrained but specific language, an encounter that will occur across a limited window of time and will conclude when the null state resolves. The text does not describe what the beings do during the 3 days. The text does not describe the outcome of the encounter. The text simply describes that it will occur, and that when the null state resolves, the surface world will not be the same as it was before the opening. Sign 10, drawn together, is the culmination of the sequence. The earlier 9 signs are all precursor conditions. Sign 10 is the event those precursors converge on. The peer-reviewed record documents the precursors. The peer-reviewed record cannot document the culminating event because it has not yet occurred in any documented form. Enoch's text describes the culminating event as future tense. Enoch's text specifies the astronomical marker of its arrival, and that marker, calculated by unambiguous modern astronomical methods, is approximately 3 years in the future from the current date of this documentary. Whether the correspondence between the ancient precursor descriptions and the modern documented precursor conditions extends to the culminating event is a question the peer-reviewed record cannot yet answer. What can be documented is that every one of the precursor conditions Enoch's text specifies is currently in a state matching the ancient description that the astronomical marker of the culminating event is on the calendar, and that the ancient text, in its restrained and specific way, is presenting the sequence as a coherent and continuous process building toward a specific arrival. The sequence, in Enoch's ordering, is complete at sign 10. The pattern the 10 signs describe is a pattern of progressive boundary failure, The celestial boundary weakens. The earth responds. The subterranean boundary weakens. The living creatures lose their reference points. The human civilization reshapes the surface. The reservoir of breath is disturbed. The human governance coordinates across the whole face of the earth. The forbidden knowledge diffuses. The celestial signs of transition appear. And the final boundary, the sky binding that separates the surface world from the upper deep, reaches the null state. The opening of the sealed places is the moment at which the pattern completes. Enoch wrote it down. He sealed it in cedar and clay. He preserved it in Ge'ez and Aramaic and Greek. He passed it forward through the Ethiopian church that ignored the Council of Laodicea's vote to remove it from the canon. He passed it forward through the cave at Qumran that preserved fragments the council had ordered destroyed. He passed it forward through Millik and Isaac and Nickelsburg and Stuckenbrook and Vanderkam and Nib, the scholars who worked out what the text actually said in the language it was actually written in. And what it actually says, laid out end to end against the peer-reviewed record of the 21st century, is what this documentary has now shown you. 10 signs, in order, every one of the first 8 documented, the 9th manifesting in the specific ways the text described, and the 10th on the calendar for March of the year 2029, that is sign 10. Every ancient text ends somewhere. The Book of Enoch, in the Ethiopian canon, ends with chapter 108, in which the author of the text addresses himself directly to those who will read the account in the last generation. The passage is short. It is not addressed to the reader's contemporaries. It is not addressed to the reader's ancestors. It is specifically addressed in the Ge'ez preserved at Aksum and cross-verified against the Aramaic fragments at Qumran, to those who will read the text at the time when the sequence begins to arrive. And the message of the passage is not a message of despair. It is not a message of triumph. It is a message of witness. The passage says that the author has done what he was given to do, which was to write down what he was shown. It says that he has done it as accurately as his language would allow. It says that he has preserved it as carefully as his tradition would allow. And it says that when the sequence begins to arrive, those who read the account will know what they are looking at, and they will know it because they were told in advance. Enoch's closing message, in the specific Ge'ez terminology preserved at Aksum, is that the account was given not to prevent what would come, but to inform those who would live through it. The message is not that the arrival can be stopped. The message is that the arrival should not come as a surprise. That is what this documentary has now shown you. The account is more than 2,000 years old. It is preserved in manuscripts held in a cedar box in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in the highlands of Ethiopia. It is cross-verified against fragments held in the Israel Museum Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. It has been translated into English by scholars including R. H. Charles in 1906, Ephraim Isaac in 1983, Michael Nib in 1978, and Lauren Stuckenbrook in 2007, each of whom restored increasing amounts of the specific technical language that earlier translations had softened. The account describes 10 signs. It describes them in order. It describes them with a specificity of language that, when laid down next to the modern peer-reviewed record, matches at the level of technical vocabulary and quantitative detail. The first 8 of the signs are documented: the celestial disturbance, the earth's cry, the rising waters, the disoriented creatures, the age of iron, the disturbance of the reservoir of breath, the coordinated global governance, the diffusion of forbidden knowledge. Every one of these signs is in the current peer-reviewed record. Every one of them has quantitative measurement. Every one of them has named investigators, published papers, and institutional documentation. And every one of them is described by its own investigators as unprecedented in the modern record. The 9th sign is manifesting in the specific ways the text described, with the specific astronomical marker calculated to occur in March of the year 2029. And the 10th sign, according to the text's own chronological structure, arrives when the 9th sign completes. You now know what the account says. You now know what the record shows. You now know the correspondence between the two. And you now know the specific date the text identifies as the marker of the transition to the final phase. What you do with the knowledge is not a matter this documentary can address. Enoch's closing chapter says only that those who read the account should know what they are looking at. The account has been laid out. The record has been laid out. The correspondence has been laid out. Enoch called his generation the fathers who did not know. He said that the sons of men in the last generation would know what the fathers did not know. He said the knowledge would arrive in the form of a specific account, preserved through specific channels, and available to those who chose to read it. The account is preserved. The channels held. The account is available. You have now read it, or rather heard it, in the version this documentary has reconstructed from the peer-reviewed record and the ancient text laid side by side. Whatever comes next comes next. What Enoch was given to do was to write it down. What the Ethiopian church was given to do was to preserve it. What the scholars of the 20th and 21st centuries were given to do was to translate it accurately. What this documentary was given to do was to lay it next to the record so those who read it now can see what those who wrote it then saw. And what you are given to do, whatever that turns out to be, you now have the information to do with awareness of the sequence you are living inside. Consider what has been laid down here. A cedar box in the highlands of Ethiopia. A shepherd throwing a stone into a cave in 1947 and hearing pottery break. Fragments in Aramaic from more than 2,000 years ago. Scholars working out what the text actually says in the language it was actually written in. Peer-reviewed publications on the magnetic field, on ocean deoxygenation, on migratory bird disorientation, on fast radio bursts, on the extraction of iron, on global governance, on the diffused watcher knowledge, and on the specific astronomical alignment on the calendar for March of the year 2029. All of the separate lines converge on a single description of the era we are inside. Enoch called it the days of the ending. The peer-reviewed record calls it the Anthropocene. The names differ. The reality itself has not shifted. 10 signs, in order. Every one of the first 8 documented, the 9th manifesting now, the 10th on the calendar. That is what Enoch saw. That is what he wrote down. That is what has been preserved for you. And that is where the account ends, and where this sequence, still in progress, continues to unfold outside this documentary in the order the ancient text described. The Book of Enoch has now told you what it was all preserved to tell you. The next move belongs to the world.